Chapter 752. Dang dang dang. Bells rang rapidly in the Lion Palace, and the monks of the Holy Church swarmed out, stepping barefoot on the white marble, and came to the Ironheart Square. Above the city of Leo, clouds gathered, and rolling dark clouds were pressing down from the sky. The great Mana Tide was just as Brando had expected. From the 10 cities to the shining sea, from the Mech realm of the Hazel people to the hanging cloud mountains in the far east, the surge of the Mana Tide alarmed everyone. Everyone stopped what they were doing and looked up in surprise. An obscure blue was crossing the dark sky, shining like the first light of dawn, and piercing through the clouds like a curved arc, crossing half the sky and piercing the canopy overhead. The astrologers of Wond were terrified at this moment. The sea of mana was roaring violently, and every saint who hid in the prayer room and prayed devoutly to their god could not calm the turmoil in their hearts. Dark clouds covered the light of the stars and the moon, and darkness passed over the mountains, plains, shining lakes and rolling forests. From west to east, the pillars of order in every holy church on the vast land of Wond lit up one by one. Martha's Law of Tiamat issued a warning to everyone, heralding the coming of an era of chaos. On the Ironheart Square, the lofty bishops looked up at the dramatic changes in the sky with an indescribable expression on their faces. Some people were whispering, but more people had begun to turn around. Go to the Sublime Hall, ignite the crystal of order, and send an announcement to the other holy churches. The loud voice passed through the square, and the first drizzle drifted down from the sky. In the blink of an eye, the temperature had dropped sharply. Everyone turned back, and behind them, the bells in the city were ringing. And across the sea, the bugas floated in the sky, and dozens of cities were flying slowly above the clouds. In the darkness, lightning occasionally illuminated the silver spires of the towers. In Onais, the astrologers walked out of their white tower one by one. Those archmages in white robes and holding long scrolls, even if they could not see, could still feel the changes in the world's order. The huge magic circle of Tiamat was changing its orbit. The entire world rumbled. In the distant heavenly realm, in the depths of the sea of clouds, lightning would occasionally fall, like a winding flame that lit up the pitch-black sea. The pale electric light passed through the attic window with a strong foreign style, casting the shadow of the craftsmanship patterns on his thin and long cheeks. William held the wizard's chess piece and seemed to be in deep thought. His face was pale. He sat upon the throne of the 12 protector kings, the throne behind him like an elongated shadow. The pointed back of the throne, which symbolized supreme knowledge, extended infinitely toward the vault in this environment, brimming with mysterious majesty. The old mage remained motionless like a statue. His deep gaze was fixated on the arched hall that towered like the vault of heaven below the handrail. The depths of his eyes were like the restless sea of magic at this moment, containing an endless fog. The great wizards in silver robes passed through the empty corridor one after another. They passed through the heavy curtains hanging from the arched beams, passed through the hall, and came under the gaze of 320 pairs of eyes. They raised their heads. Above them, the members of the Silver Union were no longer sleepy like they usually were. Instead, they were all frowning. There were no whispers. The air was filled with an ominous aura. Citizens of Buga, great wizards, salute knowledge, salute the truth. A voice reverberated in the hall, echoing repeatedly but then roaring angrily. A wizard in a white robe held a parchment scroll in his hand. He raised his head like a lion and questioned everyone. Today, who foresaw all of this and concealed the truth? We demand an answer. Is this the sign of destruction and new life, in the prophecy, or is it the sea of magic showing its anger once every few decades? The borders of Tiamat have long been unable to suppress the rising and violent power. The archivists and the Silver Candle Association have sensed the arrival of a great change from every subtle sign on the 1,400 nodes. But what about our Senate? The senators are still sleepy. Where is the eye of the Revelator? Where are the scepters of the 10th realm? The wizard waved his fist powerfully like a challenge. Since the War of the Holy Saints, the reaction of the Bugas of the Silver Folk has been slow day after day, like those arrogant reptiles. This alliance is aging, and only a new spirit can reinvigorate it. Change is coming. Are we going to miss the opportunity again? The Silver Elves have appeared, and according to that ancient language, we should also ask for self-cleansing and reformation. I plead, initiate arbitration. More voices shouted, and the hall buzzed for a moment. The distorted face seemed to be deformed by excessive anger. The silver-haired, kind-looking old man withdrew his gaze from the overly exaggerated face below. He glanced at the members who were looking at each other and could not help but throw the queen in his hand onto the chessboard. With a clang, the chessboard seemed to come alive. The black and white grids turned into a swamp, sinking William's bishop into it and slowly swallowing it. Those fellows are getting worse and worse, Isaac's disciples and grand-disciples. The old man's face was full of bored disdain, but if he didn't speak, if he didn't sit on the throne of the 12 protector kings, and if he didn't wear the distinctive purple robe with the lightning symbol, who would have guessed that this old wizard who looked like a human old man was the king of knowledge, Solomon, the leader of the 12 magi of the Silver School? In his most glorious era, his voice was the truth, his actions were the law, and he was the ultimate symbol of power and knowledge on the earth. Mortals thought that he had long become a god, but he was still Solomon, the Silver Folk, the most powerful person on the Bugis pillar. For the rest of his life, Solomon considered himself to be only a wizard. Better said than sung, isn't that the guy's usual style, huh? Let them be, the Floss faction wants to have more influence on the course of the world. With great power comes great responsibility, isn't that their slogan? William had a smile on his face and the chess piece in his hand moved erratically. Of course, actually they are not wrong, this is their responsibility, leave it to them, they're just a bunch of juniors. The old wizard knocked the chess piece in his hand on the table, and the chessboard and chess pieces suddenly turned into a pool of silver liquid. This pool of liquid shook on the table, as if it was afraid of William, and quickly flowed down from the table to the ground, escaping into the darkness. The old man raised his long eyebrows and laughed. But the silver elves are not to be trifled with, we just have to take care of our own affairs. But his eyebrows knitted together as he said this, and there was a hint of coldness in his old and wise eyes. He pursed his lips and added seriously, but we have to distinguish between friend and foe. If some opportunistic people think that they can seize the opportunity to hold the Senate hostage, they will get what they deserve. The alliance of Nettas was established by the wizards by pressing their hands on the Book of Knowledge. Knowledge and power have never been separated, the law is to maintain order, but in the end, it is the sanction of the minority against the majority, and no one can question the authority of the Silver Alliance. The old man with silver hair was indifferent to these words. He frowned and stared at the few remaining chess pieces on the table. Lightning leaped on the clouds outside the window, illuminating his face 2 or 3 times, and the fine wrinkles on his forehead. Finally, Solomon raised his snow-white eyebrows, looked up and said angrily, "No, you should have lost this game, William." "No, how could it be?" William innocently raised his eyebrows as if he was still a child and denied, "I still have some tricks up my sleeve." Solomon narrowed his eyes and stared at his old friend. "Come on, old friend, you see, playing chess is just a way for mortals to pass the time. We have already wasted too much time on it. You and I have both passed the age of arguing about victory and defeat. Everything is orderly and chaotic, but in the end it all comes back to one. In some ways, those fellows of All for One are not wrong, but they do not understand that everything has its own meaning of existence. The course of the world is fixed, and any change by the hands of others will break the original balance. There is no wrong and there is no right, everything is just going with the flow." The old mage hurriedly laughed, diverting the topic. Solomon saw that his old friend showed weakness and did not continue on this topic. "But thanks to you and Tullman, we discovered the abnormality of the Sea of Magic in the loop of trade winds and time, otherwise this time we would have been caught by those fellows. Although the Council of Elders will not be shaken, it will inevitably be awkward. The law of Tiamat also has imperfections, the mortals can only count on Martha, and we can only count on ourselves." But he raised his head again and asked, "But what I really want to ask is, what is the master of the Mithril Fortress planning to do now?" "Tullman?" The face of a young man suddenly appeared in William's mind. "He is still staying in Erewhon, you know, human emotions are a wonderful thing, homeland, country, family, and friendship. Tullman's life in the mortal world has more or less changed him, he is probably planning to help that small country." As William spoke, he turned around and a bolt of lightning fell, the fire of the lightning reflected in his eyes. "It's not good to say it too easily, old friend. Even the silver folk have emotions, it's just that they don't show it that much." Solomon crossed his arms and replied, "But your motive shouldn't be that simple, right? Other than the azure lance, did you discover something else?" "It's not really a discovery, discovery is a very serious word. It should be said that I met an interesting little fellow by chance, it reminded me of an old friend." "Ah, you're right, the silver folk have emotions too." William smiled slightly. "I met that old friend when I passed through Erewhon in my early years. It's a pity that human life is too short. Yes, whether it's the ambition of a lion or the firm and enduring faith of a white oak in the human world, it will eventually be gradually forgotten with the passage of time. Only the law is different because things that rely on emotions are fragile, only the truth is consistent. Solomon replied indifferently, but with the unique pride of the silver folk. It's a little in line with your style, but we can't help but be swayed by emotions just like I asked you to do. During the time I'm gone, it's best not to let the radicals win too much support. I suspect there will be a war, but neither the Bugas nor the Silver Elves are ready yet. Solomon did not answer, but just put away the chess pieces on the table, even as William straightened up beside him. In the storm outside the window, in the midst of lightning and thunder, William stretched out his hand, and the staff immediately flew from the corner and landed firmly in his hand. Solomon then asked, "I haven't asked yet, where are you going and at this time?" The old mage pulled on his hat, the shadow of the wizard's hat covering his face, only revealing the long silver beard below. "I feel a little displacement in one of the monitoring nodes. If I'm not wrong, maybe something interesting will happen." "I see." Solomon raised an eyebrow. The following speech was at its most intense moment, but unfortunately the listeners were distracted. Dark clouds filled the sky from the Grey Bay to the Shire Road. It was already raining heavily. Fortunately, the people of the Shire of Roe had already considered this when they built the city, and built perfect drainage facilities on both sides of the road. Every year after midsummer, the rain clouds would come from the Sea of Eternal Death, and would be blocked by the hanging cloud mountains, gathering into rain and slowly falling. But this year the rain was especially plentiful, and the mountain torrents had already destroyed many bridges. A group of knights rushed out of the rain, and moved forward on the muddy path in the mountains with difficulty. In the heavy rain, the men and horses were all draped in sky-blue battle robes. The emblem on the battle robes was the pattern of a 9-headed snake, and most of the knights were also wearing elf-style battle armor. Under the pointed helmets, pointed ears and light green hair were exposed, proving their identity. "Lord Marquis is just in front," a loud voice shouted, but it was almost drowned out by the sound of the rain. "Did any of you see clearly what it was?" The only tall elf in the group turned around on the back of his horse, his elven chainmail rattling, but he did not care about these details and only used a serious tone to ask. The style of his armor was very exquisite, and light green magic seemed to be flowing on the surface of the armor, preventing the rainwater from entering. The tall elf turned his head and looked at his followers. His face was solemn, but he was very handsome, and his sky-blue eyes contained uneasiness and worry. "A ball of fire, Lord." That was Sarah's tear. The knights stood in the rain looking at each other. They did not know what this lord from the central province was worried about. Wasn't it just a meteorite? The mortals on the ground thought that meteorites and shooting stars were the tears of the dragons in the sky, and only a few witches thought that it was an omen of misfortune. However, most of the crystallized meteorites came from the Sea of Magic, and when a burning meteorite passed through the sky above the forest, it would sometimes cause a mountain fire. But the meteorite itself contained a large amount of magic crystals, which was a huge fortune, and every knight's heart was burning. But the tall elf did not answer. The world paid attention to these minor details, but few people noticed that since the year of flowers and summer leaves, the number of Sarah's tear had increased. In the county of Roe alone, there were more than 30 sightings. He remembered the data displayed in the file. Those numbers were meaningless in the eyes of an ordinary person, but in the eyes of a person of his status, they were like sharp blades inserted into the map, shining with a frightening cold light. The law of Tiamat was weakening. But how could this be? Marquis Stauffen turned his head and stared at the surging magic tide in the sky. The blue sky was like an arc of light reflected in his eyelids, but the light seemed a little deep. The knight around him did not know his true identity at all. The country people only thought that nobles like him from the central province were greedy and afraid of death, but they did not know that he was the Night Song Knight of the Holy Cathedral of Wind Empress. It was ridiculous. The border of Saint Tassol was becoming more and more unstable. Unfortunately, most of the nobles of the Elven court still stubbornly believed that it was just the disturbance of the undead, but Madara did not have the energy to start two wars at the same time. He had a faint feeling that things were not that simple. The report of 7 months clearly indicated that the number of monsters at the border was increasing. To be precise, they were reproducing at an alarming rate. Lords from all over the country reported dozens of attacks, but they were deliberately concealed by the people below who pretended to be peaceful. These tricks could be hidden from the Elven court, but not from the secret knight of the Holy Cathedral. The priests had mentioned more than once that the great demonic wave might just be a sign, and he, like the Summer King Shaglafen, suspected another possibility. "I hope there is good news from Fanzan. The Holy Cathedral of Fire is really becoming more and more depraved." They are actually stuck in the mire of a small Erewhon. Stoffan silently hid these thoughts in his heart. He glanced at his temporary followers who had a look of indifference on their faces, turned around and pulled out his sword. The blade of the sword shone in the rain. Be careful of the monsters in the forest. Let's continue forward. The knight responded in unison and turned to move forward. But only Marquis Stoffan's heart was still shrouded in a shadow. He looked up in front of him. The dark forest was like a giant mouth that swallowed everything. In the heavy rain he shivered. P.S. Those in the group today should know that I'm outside attending someone's wedding. So I shouldn't have gone. I started typing this chapter when I came back and it messed up my schedule, but it feels good. I could have written a little more, but I looked at the time and decided not to. I'm now adjusting my work and rest schedule so that I can write regularly and update regularly in the future. That's it for today. I'll put up the 10,000-word chapter tomorrow before 5 o'clock. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Jianghu to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 753. Compared to the turmoil of the entire world, the stillness of the stained frost forest was more like a pool of stagnant water without ripples. The world inside and outside seemed to be separated by an invisible wall, leaving only the skylight that filled the dark night sky. The night passed through the forest, the pine trees rustling in the night wind, and it was not until the early hours of the morning that they gradually recovered some of the missing people. But what surprised Brando the most was that Freya and Lorena found the sleeping huntress in a small forest. Peya was also the last person to return to the team, and her return was beyond Brando's expectations. The more confusion there was in the dream, the greater the power of seduction. Everyone knew about the nightmare in the huntress' heart, and it should have been impossible for her to break free from the terrible dream that belonged to her. But she succeeded, and when she was found, she was sleeping quietly in a mossy field. The look on her face was like that of a sleeping princess, without the usual wildness of a hunter, but there were traces of tears on her face. Brando asked Maynel to check on the other person's condition, and after confirming that there was no major problem, he told the others not to disturb her. Peya's dream had reached the final stage, and all that was left was to wait quietly for her to wake up. As long as she appeared outside the world of fog, it meant that she would wake up. There was no need to worry too much about the rest. The knights scattered among the woodland for a short rest according to Brando's orders. Brando also sat down against a cedar tree, and the little prince came over and asked for his sword back with a red face, and then ran away. Not far away, Maynard gave him a strange look, which made Brando feel a little guilty. Although he did not know why Maynard appeared in his and Haru's dream, presumably she had seen Haru's female attire. I hope that guy doesn't tell Her Royal Highness. He probably won't. Maynard doesn't seem like the kind of woman who gossips. Brando thought to himself. He suspected that if Princess Griffin knew what he had done, she might really stab him to death. Thinking about these messy things, he took out the equipment dropped by Viscount Caldel's negative emotions from the Dimension Cave to appraise. He twisted the shiny object out. It was a necklace. He placed the necklace in the palm of his left hand. The chain shone with a faint luster as if it was made of silver. The pendant was in the shape of a circling heart. He vaguely felt that he had seen this item somewhere before. He thought for a moment and suddenly thought of a possibility. Could it be that thing? Brando's heart flashed with joy and he hurriedly opened his status panel. Atoya's determination, magic, strength plus 20, physique plus 20, wind resistance plus 5, fire resistance plus 5, water resistance plus 5, earth resistance plus 5 inch. It really is this thing. Brando felt a strange surprise in his heart. He subconsciously lifted the necklace and turned it around. Sure enough, he found a simple sentence engraved on the back of the pendant, Dia Oasim Flame. It meant, all elements are for my use. This ancient text was the magic runes from before Wand was born. It existed even longer than the witch's words. However, these words had lost their magic and become a mere tool to store information. The text actually referred to the Azure Dragon, the ruler of the elements. Toya was her name. However, after the fall of Babel Fortress, mortals preferred to call her the Calamity. This necklace could only be considered average at this level. However, it had a special meaning to Brando because, like the Ring of the Wind Empress, it was actually a quest item. The beginning and end of the Calamity, the jewel of the Dragonborn crown. This legendary item was the final reward of this series of quests. It could expand the pool of the 4 elements at the same time. It was one of the divine necklaces of the elementalists. It was also something that Brando was now determined to get. Originally, Brando planned to find a way to buy this quest necklace, but he did not expect to get it so easily. However, Atoya's determination itself was not a rare thing. The difficulty of this quest lay in the process, not the means to trigger it. Brando took off the Star of Flame from his neck. This necklace had been with him since the Eversong Forest, but the ruby on the pendant had long been shattered and destroyed in the last war in Ampere Seal. He put the Star of Flame beside him and took Atoya's determination with him. Although Atoya's determination was not the best, it was always better than nothing. Then Brando took another look at the dimension hole that was divided into two lines. In the dimension hole, there was a large pile of spoils from the loop of trade winds. Brando had never thought of organizing them. Among these messy things, there was a cylindrical object about the length of an arm that flickered with a dim light. He was slightly startled and then remembered that it was a spoil from the battle with the demons. At first, Amandina had this thing and then she passed it to him. He still had not figured out what it was used for. However, there was really nothing to understand about demon items. They were not things that could be controlled by mortals. Most of them had side effects of one kind or another, and the consequences of using them without authorization were generally not good. For example, Countess Dilfrey was still unable to get out of bed and walk for a long time. The priests of the Holy Cathedral also said that her body had a hidden disease, and Brando had always felt guilty about it. However, this was still considered to be relatively light. It was not uncommon for people to lose their lives or even have their souls imprisoned forever because of using demon items. Brando thought of Dilfrey and lost interest in the thing. Although the witches in the Cynthia area were good at inspecting demon items, he did not need to go there specifically. After inspecting the thing in his hand, his heart inexplicably calmed down along with the forest. The morning breeze began to blow through the canopy, making a soft sound that almost made people want to fall asleep. But no one could sleep because as soon as they closed their eyes, they would think of the nightmare from before. Brando felt someone sitting beside him. It was Scarlet. She did not even need to ask for the permission of her lord to sit beside Brando. She looked back and watched Brando's movements quietly with her beautiful amber eyes. "What's the matter?" Brando asked. Scarlet took out a ring and handed it to Brando. Brando saw the ring in her hand. The ring looked very strange on the surface, a bit like someone had polished it with pebbles, very smooth and plain. But he froze for a moment before realizing that it was a magic ring. "Is this your lute?" Scarlet nodded. That was the relic of the lost one. It seemed that Scarlet's luck was not bad. He took the ring. The stone ring was very smooth to the touch, and the surface seemed to be satin, but he could not tell what it was. But Brando was not in a hurry to guess its attributes. This kind of stone artifact was very rare in Wonde, and some even witnessed the beginning of the whole world. He rubbed the inside of the ring with his hand and felt a line of thin dents. It was the text of the Mar people. "This is an ancient artifact." Brando could not help but exclaim, "Scarlet, you're really lucky." Scarlet looked at him, puzzled. Most of the magic items after the destruction of Babel Fortress came from after Tumen discovered the Mageweth, but before that, there were already all kinds of magic items. Brando explained, "These magic items are not necessarily more powerful than what we see now, but they are very strange." He held up the ring as he spoke, and the faint blue light in the sky shone through the leaves and branches, projecting from the hole in the middle of the ring, forming a beam of light. The attributes of the ring also appeared in his field of vision at the same time. Ring of Stone, Fantasy. Strength plus 75 additional skills. Eternal Kinship. When the ring bearer is on the ground, the additional attributes of the Ring of Stone are doubled. A level 40 ring added 150 strength. Although it was only on the ground, such extreme attributes were very rare in the magic items of the Mageweth era. Its additional skills also happened to illustrate this point. Ancient magic items generally focused on one aspect, but had a variety of restrictions. In the game, players said that they belonged to a special category of cursed items, and Brando felt that this was understandable. This ring did not have too many special skills, but just the increased attributes itself was enough to be amazing at this level. In particular, Brando suddenly thought that this ring was tailor-made for Scarlet. Because of the attributes of the Azure Lance and the strong physical recovery of the Dragonborn, she did not need to pay too much attention to defense, and this Ring of Stone was undoubtedly the best illustration of an all-attack warrior for her. "This is a ring blessed by Gaia." Brando put down the ring and replied to Scarlet, "You are very lucky, it is a trophy that belongs to you." Scarlet listened to Brando's answer and was a little quiet. She could roughly guess the preciousness of the ring but only replied, "I don't need it, my lord. Believe me, compared to me it suits you better." Brando smiled at the Highlander girl. "Give me your hand, I'll put it on for you." Scarlet was stunned. Brando was completely immersed in his own imagination. Offensive warriors were rare in the game because the way of combat determined that the survival ability of melee physical professions must be stronger than other professions. Close range meant that it was more difficult to avoid some range spells and attacks, and the necessary health and defensive ability to survive these battles. Professions like the Nightingale could compensate with high-speed movement and dexterity, but what did a warrior have? What a warrior could rely on was nothing more than solid armor and a strong physique. But nothing was absolute, and Brando yearned for such a spirit in his heart. Because focusing on strength, a warrior became like an extremely sharp, but also extremely easy to break glass blade. Brando felt that this trait was very suitable for Scarlet's combat style. The girl inherited some of the characteristics of the Highlanders, and was unyielding in battle, so much so that when you watched such a lady in battle, it was difficult to imagine her usual temperament. But when Brando thought about it, he did not think about what his request meant to the Highlander girl. According to the customs of the Highlanders, only the most intimate of lovers would give each other rings. Of course, their rings did not have so much power, and sometimes were even just a garland, but it symbolized each other's restraint and admiration. Scarlet let Brando put the ring on her in a daze, and for a moment felt as if time had stopped flowing. Brando held her hand and carefully put the ring of stone on, then looked up and asked, "How is it?" Scarlet seemed to have just reacted. She tried to put aside those irrelevant thoughts and carefully felt it, then muttered, "It's amazing, my strength has increased by 20 to 30%. According to Miss Alaz, it should be the strength of a young dragon. Then it's close to the power of elemental awakening, but only at this level of strength. You can feel it carefully, this will be good for your elemental awakening in the future. But remember, you only have this kind of strength when you're on the ground. If you fight, try to avoid being led to other battlefields by others," Brando warned. "Okay." Scarlet was silent and nodded, but then whispered, "I can also elemental awakening, my lord? You're more knowledgeable than others, and the elemental wall will not be your threshold. Besides, the blood flowing in your body is golden, you should be more proud than others, you never have to belittle yourself, Scarlet." Brando looked at Scarlet and whispered encouragement. The Highlander girl did not answer, but clenched the azure lance in her hand. Brando noticed this detail and guessed what she was thinking. He looked back, the whole dream quest was a complete dungeon quest, there were quests and experience and there was a lot of it. He opened the panel and found that with the remaining part from before, it was almost enough to upgrade the Templar Knight to the next level. Originally, in Brando's plan, continuing to upgrade the Templar Knight's level was not the best choice, but since he found that his physique had been further strengthened after elemental awakening, he changed his mind. Since the strengthening was the physique, then the Templar Knight's tank-type route did not seem unacceptable. He thought about it for a moment and chose to upgrade his level. The attribute bonuses of high-level professions had become extremely high in the later stages, and after 10 levels, Brando could almost feel his overall strength rising by a level, almost a third of the original. In fact, the period after crossing the elemental wall was the fastest time to level up. He had experienced this in the game, but after going through the elemental enlightenment, the speed of gaining experience would slow down 1,000 times. After that, he would have to slowly accumulate experience. Fortunately, the players with the system were several times faster than the natives. Not long after, the news of the Hunter Girl's awakening came. Freya brought him the news, and when Brando and Scarlet went to take a look, they saw the Hunter Girl's thick eyelashes move slightly, and then she opened her eyes. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 754. At this time, almost half an hour had passed since she was discovered, and Brando saw Peya, who had just woken up, look at her surroundings blankly. There seemed to be a trace of confusion in her eyes, and the confusion in her dark eyes turned into a strong sense of vigilance. She suddenly turned over and bounced up from the ground like a female beast, and her hand subconsciously reached for the short bough behind her back. But she was destined to catch nothing. Then Peya woke up, and when she saw Brando she seemed to be stunned. I'm sorry, Sir Knight. I thought, but Peya's words suddenly stopped. Brando saw a look of horror on her face, and she turned around and glanced at the surrounding forest as if she had seen a ghost. How could, it's exactly the same. Peya suddenly took a few steps back, ignoring everyone around her. She observed the surrounding forest as she retreating faster and faster, and then ran wildly, disappearing into the forest in the blink of an eye. Peya's action stunned everyone, and Brando was also slightly startled, and then noticed that the direction the hunter maiden had disappeared in was the exit to Milo's breath. "Brando?" Freya asked from the side. "What's wrong with Peya? Should we go after her?" Everyone looked at each other, not knowing what had happened, and Brando himself was also confused. Peya's previous behavior was not that of a reckless person. On the contrary, she could be called an excellent hunter. And most of the best hunters had one trait in common: calm and collected. Brando only hesitated for a moment before saying, "Follow her." Faint starlight began to appear in the forest, indicating that they were leaving the range of the Evernight forest. In the dim light, Brando saw the hunter maiden in front of him shuttling through the forest like a vigorous female leopard. She was not stubbornly going deep into the forest, but instead seemed to be scouting the way, occasionally stopping to wait for them. This made Brando feel a little more at ease. What he hated the most in a group operation was to leave one's post without permission and put others in danger. Such an action was selfish and stupid. But it seemed that Peya had not lost her mind, and Brando occasionally saw her stop and look around with a puzzled look on her face. This confirmed his conjecture that the hunter maiden must have discovered something in the dream. Sometimes dreams would reveal the future, and such a chance was extremely small, but if Peya's and her brother's dreams were entangled, it was not impossible. Brando realized that Peya might have seen the direction in which Grand Duke Arek and the others were heading in. This was the only possibility that could make the young hunter girl lose her composure. However, this at least meant that her brother was not dead. At least he was not dead when they passed through this forest. In this way, the team moved forward for about 2 or 3 hours under Peya's leadership. During this time, the huntress never deviated from the direction leading to the glacier, which further showed that Brando's hunch was correct. If Arek and the others had also passed through here, they would not have easily left the correct route. And it was at this time that the hunter maiden finally stopped. Brando parted the bushes with a crash and caught up with her from behind with everyone. He saw Peya standing blankly under a cedar tree. Brando walked over to take a look and saw that Peya was holding a dagger in her hand. This dagger definitely did not belong to the hunter maiden, because her dagger was still clipped to her boots. Other than that, Peya should not be armed with any weapons. "Is this your brother's thing?" Brando glanced at the dagger, which was just a very ordinary animal skin knife. Nobles would not use such a vulgar thing, and only hunters in this area would use it. The hunter maiden turned her head, and Brando was surprised to see her red eyes. Peya rubbed the corners of her eyes, took a breath to calm down, and replied, "Can the dream be real, my lord?" "What's wrong?" "I don't know. I was alone in the dream and I dreamed of everything that happened that day. I dreamed that I was dead, frozen to death in the river, but my soul was muddled, and I seemed to hear a voice calling me. I saw the pale night and I followed them in a daze. I saw my brother and I saw those people that day. They passed through this forest and moved forward slowly, and I saw my brother following them behind a taller figure. I saw him pass by here and fall. I called him, but he didn't answer me, and I saw his dagger fall here." Peya lowered her head and looked at the dagger in her hand with some fear. "It's here. What else did you see?" Brando immediately realized that this should be her brother's dream, and her brother should have also experienced the dream of the lost names, and then left part of his memory here. But he was a little curious. Her brother's dream was so incomplete, and it seemed that he had passed through here, which was incredible, and he could not help but continue to ask. "I saw them walk into an ice field, the wind and snow covered their figures, and I stayed there forever." The huntress looked up, her eyes flashing with a strange panic, and she shuddered. "Am I dead, Sir Knight?" She looked at Brando blankly and asked, almost trembling, Am I a ghost now?" Brando felt that the huntress's question was a little absurd, but he could probably understand the panic in Peya's heart. Not everyone knew the mysterious legends like he did, and most of the country people would attribute incomprehensible things to ghosts and gods. He coughed to wake Peya up. "You're not dead. The dream is absurd, but part of what you saw may be true. Your younger brother might have survived as well. Just like what you saw, that part is actually the memory he left behind here." Peya heard this and trembled all over. "Really? Of course you understand I don't have to lie to you," Brando replied. Peya clenched her hands into fists with excitement. Her chest rose and fell rapidly. She turned around and thought for a moment, then turned back and said to Brando with some embarrassment, "I'm sorry, Sir Knight, I was a little too reckless before." Brando sighed. What else could he say? You can ask a soldier to abide by military discipline, but Peya was certainly not a soldier, nor an adventurer or a mercenary. She was just a hunter. But he still lectured her. "Just remember in the future what you did before was very dangerous, not just for you but for others as well. The knight behind you, some of them are like you, have brothers, sisters, or parents of children. Do you have the heart to let their loved ones lose them? I'm sorry. Peya hung her head in shame this time. She knew that nobles had many rules and people of her status did not need to ask why at all, they just needed to abide by them. But Brando explained it to her, which made her blush instead. Although she was in awe of those high and mighty nobles, she did not necessarily agree with their values deep down, but Brando's words made her realize that people were actually the same, and the rules in a team were just to protect everyone in it. For the first time, Brando accepted the hunter girl's apology, not for his identity but for such behavior. Can you determine the route of Grand Duke Arek and the others? He asked again. The hunter girl was slightly startled, then nodded. That's easy, Brando replied. Glacier of Despair. Ever since entering this boundless ice field, Alaz had not stopped losing her temper for a single day. She felt that if she had known this would happen, she would have been with Brando instead of listening to him and going to meet up with Veronica with that dull ash sword saint. Of course, there were many things that made her dissatisfied. For example, the cold climate made her skin rougher, and the chattering ambassador of the Crew's Night Order also pushed her patience to the limit. Which I did. That guy used to see that she was one of Erwin's people, and dared to talk to her with that kind of attitude. If she did not want to expose her identity, she would have turned into her dragon form and swallowed the other party in one gulp, so that her ears would not be bombarded with fatigue all day long. It was the same for the descendants of the arrogant Kurlutzian nobles. Sometimes she would secretly squint and stare at those annoying guys with her golden eyes, hatefully thinking about whether to cut open all these arrogant guys' stomachs after this matter was over. But that was just a thought. Although the dragons were arrogant, they were not stupid. The Holy Cathedral of Fire behind the Crew's nobles would never allow the dragons to mess around in human territory. Of course, the 4 holy cathedrals were not the key was those annoying, self-righteous Bugas. Every time she thought of the existence of the silver folk in this world, Alaz could not help but gnash her teeth in hatred. If it were not for the Bugas, who always boasted of being messianic craftsmen, the dragons would have already turned humans and elves into toys. How annoying. Alaz cursed fiercely in her heart, cursing the smiling old man to crash his head and die as soon as possible, and for Onais and the other floating cities to fall into the sea as soon as possible. She curled a few curls of her platinum hair around her ears and muttered as she walked out of her tent. If it were not for the news that Brando and his party had arrived, she would not have bothered to show up. It was so cold outside. The silver folk, who had ill intentions towards the dragons, called them big lizards. Alaz of course could not accept this name, but dragons were indeed cold-blooded animals, and there was no disputing that. Except for the white dragons, most of the other types of dragons would feel uncomfortable in cold weather. Alaz sneezed in the snow and rubbed the tip of her little red nose. She looked like a weak, lowly, not a scary little female dragon. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 755. If Alaz's curse were to come true, it would be enough to destroy the entire Buga's wizard craftsmen and their floating city 10 times over, and there would be nothing left of them. Even Brando would be implicated. For example, our little female dragon lady cursed Brando at least 20 times to make him lose the ability to reproduce. Fortunately, Brando was unaware of these vicious curses at the moment. He and Veronica agreed to meet in the valley near the Breath of Despair. Cruz's people were indeed one step ahead of them. Veronica and the Ash Sword Saint were both long-established powerhouses, and the Forest of Tears in front of them was unlikely to stop their progress. Even if Alaz was lazy and did not contribute, a small level 50 dungeon would not cause any trouble for Cruz's people. When Brando stepped into the camp of the Azure Skies Legion, Veronica was frowning in the thick felt tent, one hand on her forehead, looking at the map in her hand. This map was actually provided by Duke Vero, whom Eek had persuaded. The Lantan Islands had left early and arrived at Fort Valendon, and even Her Royal Highness, who left later, had already arrived in the Manowar area. But seriously speaking, Duke Lantan Island and the Holy Cathedral of Fire, especially Cruz's people, had no friendship and had a lot of enmity. So the female commander of the Azure Skies Legion knew very well that the young man named Eek was probably helping them because of Brando's face. And when she thought of the young man Erwin she saw in the Loop of Trade Winds, she could not help but smile slightly, but then she sighed. Of course, she had heard of what had happened in Ampere Seal. She was a general of the Empire, and of course she knew where the interests of the Empire lay. She knew that the young man might become a difficult opponent for the Empire, but she did not expect this day to come so soon. She looked up and glanced at Mephisto, who was not far away with his arms crossed and looking straight ahead. The Ash Sword Saint did not have a good impression of the Cruz people, so he rarely went anywhere other than to discuss matters with Veronica. In fact, even if he was willing to go, Veronica might not feel at ease. For the people of Cruz he was a big devil. "That good student of yours is here. Aren't you going to do something?" she asked. Mephistopheles looked back at her and didn't answer. He had nothing to say to Cruz. If Veronica hadn't promised to help him restore his country, he probably wouldn't even be in the mood to appear here. However, when Veronica mentioned Brando, the Ash Blade Master could not help but feel proud. This time, Brando had taught Cruz a lesson in Ampere Seal. Even the Ash Blade Master himself had never done such a thing. The key was the use of the relationship between the Bugas and the Silver Elves to force the Cruz people to suffer in silence. This move was simply played beautifully. Mephistopheles couldn't help but be satisfied. However, if he could make Cruz bleed more, he might be even more satisfied. Veronica didn't mind seeing him like this. She was already used to it. At this time she heard footsteps coming from outside the tent. She couldn't help but raise her eyebrows and her eyes moved slightly. She had already recognized the voices of Brando and his party, but to her surprise, Brando's footsteps were steadier than before. Small details could explain a lot in the eyes of a strong person like her. There were rumors that Count Tonagel had broken through the elemental wall, but she had always doubted it. Outsiders didn't know, but she knew. How old was he? But at this moment, Veronica couldn't help but look up in surprise and murmur, "Erwin actually has another temple knight who has elemental activation. Martha above, how old is he?" Hearing Veronica's sigh, Mephistopheles couldn't help but smile. The world knew him as the Ash Sword Saint. His reputation was not only in the Cruz Empire but also in the wider world. He challenged the descendant of one of the four sages with one sword. A huge empire, even the eagle that spread its wings and made everyone tremble, was like an ordinary thing in front of him. But after all, the empire was not something a mortal like him could compare to. Cruz would live forever and sooner or later he would turn into dust. People often said that dynasties rose and fell, but the cycle of dynasties was ultimately longer than a person's life. After he died, who would still remember the name of the Ash Sword Saint? But now he had a student, and this student was destined to achieve greater things than him. A 20-year-old temple knight who had elemental activation, the chosen one, was nothing more than that. But Brando was not the kind of person who was destined to be Martha's favorite at birth. In the eyes of others, his fate was controlled by him. The young man came from Bucci, and was just a descendant of a Highland knight. The protection of his ancestors had no impact on his life. If there was an ancient noble in Aween who used his own sword to plow his own land, then there was no one else in Aween. Then it must be Brando. The late King Eric, the Flame King Gretel, was nothing more than that. Some people's names were destined to shine in history, and Mephistopheles knew that his student was such a person. Maybe Cruz people could still be high and mighty now, but what about in a few decades? History always gave heroes space, and even Brendel himself did not realize it. But someone like the Ash Sword Saint, who had seen many things in his life, had already seen the cause and effect of this. He had always been arrogant, but he had to admit that the best decision he had made in his life was to choose Brando as his student. With such a student, the teacher would also be proud of it. The snow and wind whistled outside the tent. The sky had been dark ever since the beginning of the demonic wave. In any era, this was a sign of the beginning of chaos. Heroes were born, and even Mephistopheles couldn't help but sigh. Brando had already opened the tent and walked in, followed by Freya, Scarlet, Medisha, and the Shire. He saw Mephistopheles first, and quickly nodded to the Ash Sword Saint. He was already the lord of a territory, but the Ash Sword Saint was still his teacher in name, and he had taught him a lot. Brando now only had respect for the Ash Sword Saint. Only then did his gaze fall upon Veronica. In fact, he had long noticed that the female Azure Skies Legion's gaze had also long since fallen upon him. "Legion Commander, I didn't expect to meet you again so soon." Brando smiled and greeted her. "Humph, I should have captured you and Endesha back to the Empire. I didn't expect you to cause so much trouble for me so quickly." Veronica glared at Brando and snorted in anger. "Look at what you've done, brat. You probably don't know, but the Empire's noble senate is about to turn upside down." Brando naturally knew, but he took off his cloak and handed it to the knight behind him. He then raised his head and looked at the Azure Skies Legion commander with bright eyes. "Lady Veronica, you also know that you won't get any benefits from pushing all the blame on me. I'm different from the lame nobles like Erwin, and you're also different from the arrogant nobles like Cruz. There's no need to point out anything, right?" Also, I helped you capture Andesha, but His Majesty didn't give me any rewards. Brando added. Veronica couldn't help but look at this brat with amusement and anger. Lame Erewhon nobles was a proverb used by Cruz to mock the people of Erewhon. It meant that the nobles of Erewhon would bow down to the people of Cruz. An even worse usage was lame dog. But Brando felt that lame dog was not enough to describe certain people. In his opinion, the nobles of this era of Erewhon nobles were a derogatory term. At least compared to the nobles of ancient times, the nobles of today were just wriggling parasites. You still want a reward? Do you know who you've killed? That's Williams. Don't tell me he really relied on his own ability to become one of the 7 deputy commanders of the Holy Cathedral Knight. The nobles of the Empire don't have a huge family behind them. Do you know how much trouble you've caused? Veronica replied angrily. Brando spread out his hands. Anyway, I'm not going to the Empire. They can't come to Erewhon to trouble me. As long as Repassin or Duke Baishin don't send troops to Erewhon's border, do you think I'm afraid they'll find someone to assassinate me? That's not impossible. Veronica put on a straight face, but she was relieved when Brando mentioned Repassin and Duke Baishin. She admired this young man and was really afraid that he would kill Williams because he was young and impetuous. But since he knew what kind of strength was behind that guy, it meant that he must have been prepared. She took a closer look at Brando and sighed, it's easy for you to say. In that case, why are you still here to help me? Brando was not embarrassed that Veronica saw through his intentions. After all, to be able to become the commander of the Empire's Legion, the other party was naturally not a simple person. Besides, the family behind Veronica had nothing to do with Duke Baishin. As long as there was no intersection between big families, there must be conflicts. Brando felt that this was a win-win cooperation. He needed Veronica to help him maintain at least his reputation in the Empire, at least not to be called a heretic. Veronica also needed his help now, and in the future, Brando believed that the relationship between the two would only be closer. As long as he started to develop the Black Forest. However, he didn't intend to say these plans out loud. He just smiled and thanked Veronica sincerely. Thank you. Although Brando maintained the arrogance of a soul from the modern era, he actually knew that Veronica's position was not on the same level as his. One could almost say that she was the Empire's Grand Duchess, and he was only half a count in Erewhon, because Tanajul was never a count's territory. He could completely feel that she appreciated him and was willing to help him. Although he knew that the two of them might be on opposite sides, Brando made up his mind to at least not embarrass this female Legion commander too much in the future. This was not difficult to do. Although Cruz was arrogant, at least he was not to the point where he would anger the heavens and the people. He paused for a moment and decided to change the topic. Back to the topic, we just came out of the Black Forest outside. Legion commander, you must have been waiting here for a while, right? Speaking of this, Veronica suddenly sighed. Yes, we ran into some trouble, Brando. Trouble? P.S. The proofreading took some time. There are 2 other things I have to inform you. First, don't ask me where C-92 went. Second, because many people want me to respond to a lot of questions about the setting and the era, it is impossible for me to answer them one by one. I thought about it. From today onwards, if you have any questions about the setting, you can raise them in the book review section. I will be free from 9 to 9:30 every night, and I will come to the book review section to answer these questions one by one. If you have any questions you want to ask in person, you can wait until then. However, I will try my best to avoid answering questions related to the plot and character creation. Generally speaking, only the setting is involved. I know that there are some contradictions in my setting. After all, the time is too long, so let's discuss and fix it together. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 756. Trouble? Veronica tightened the fur coat on her body, revealing the graceful curves of the female legion under the coat. It was the same color as the light brown background of Kurlut's winter military uniform, the same color as Kurlut's famous brown rock. She walked towards Brando, passed by him, lifted the blanket and looked out warily. The cold wind whistled, making everyone in the tent shiver. The lady put down the blanket, turned around and said seriously, "What I'm about to tell you, you can only listen with your ears and keep your mouth shut, everyone. There are 300 soldiers in this camp, but from today onwards the food reserves are only enough to last until next week." Brendel suddenly understood why Veronica was so serious about this matter. If this news were to spread, it would definitely cause a commotion. This was the army brought by Veronica, which was the elite of Cruz. If it was the private army of the nobles, it was not impossible to cause a riot. Cruz's tacticians called the food reserves that were enough to support an army for a week. Normally, an army participating in a war would consume 2 basic units of food a week, and the garrison would be relatively less. If the food reserves were less than 4 basic units, it meant that an army that could still fight would have to consider whether to retreat or not. If the food reserves were less than 2 units, it would only happen if they were in a desperate situation. If an army with less than 1 unit did not riot, it meant that the commander had suppressed the news very well, or that the army was very elite, or both. However, Veronica had participated in the last Holy War and was a well-known general of Cruz. With the title of Goddess of War, she would never make a low-level mistake in this kind of issue. Brendel seemed to have immediately guessed why the Kurlutz people were facing the current predicament, and he asked with some understanding, "Is part of your food missing?" "How do you know?" Veronica suddenly turned her head, and her originally frowned brows relaxed, but immediately frowned again. "Do you know something, Brando?" she asked suspiciously. "Don't you know what lives in this snowfield? Didn't I ask Alas to remind you?" Brando was equally confused. This snowy plain was the lair of that damned Frost WRM, and this little one just so happened to be a famous glutton. It was very timid and only knew how to steal the food of travelers. It had been doing this in this forest and Lake Valendon all year round, so it was very skilled at its job. If normal people did not pay attention, they would easily fall for its tricks. Of course, other than being proficient in this field. This Frost WRM whelp was also an expert at sneak attacks and sneak attacks. In short, it would never fight you head-on. If there are any vile adjectives, they must be reserved for it. Alas? Veronica thought for a while before she remembered the doll-like girl who had accompanied Mephistopheles. But the only impression she had was that she always had a sour expression on her face. She did not understand why Brendel would let a little girl pass such an important message to her. Her? Veronica looked at Mephistopheles. Brando saw Veronica's expression and understood that Alas had done something good. No, she might have forgotten about it long ago. That girl? He suddenly realized that he had made a mistake. He should have let someone more reliable come, such as Amandina. Brando could only tell her about the rumor about the dragon on the lakeside road. Veronica walked back to her seat, glanced at the parchment map, and threw the hair pelt in her hand on the table. The table was actually made up of a few boxes. "You mean the one who stole our food is that dragon whelp? But that's nearly 2 months' worth of food for 300 people, 3 whole carriages. Dragons always have some mysterious spells. If it wants to hide its tracks, it's not difficult to not be discovered by you." Brando was also a little helpless. If a dragon wanted to steal your things, it would be really difficult to deal with. It's really surprising that dragons would use their noble spells to steal. This is a little different from what I read in the books. A girl in white in the corner suddenly spoke. Brando had noticed her early on. The girl had a cute baby face, a white scholar's hat on her head, eyes as blue as the sea. She was wearing a long robe with 2 blood-red crosses on her shoulders, a pair of gray squirrel leather gloves, and a thick book with a small brass cross hanging from the end of the book between the pages. "I'm sorry, I'm not questioning your words, I'm just curious." Seeing Brando's gaze sweep over, the girl hurriedly explained with a smile. "And this is?" Brando read some confidence from the other party's clear and transparent eyes. The girl was obviously not good at hiding her thoughts. Although she tried her best to appear approachable, she still gave the Erewhon people present the feeling of being treated as barbarians. This was a typical Cruz aristocrat's sense of superiority, but it had not yet turned into arrogance. She must be a child who left home for the first time. Shido, she's a descendant of Marquis Toon and is now studying at St. Eberson. She's a smart child with outstanding talent. Brando, you'll definitely like her. A wizard from the Mithril Society also took a fancy to her talent and hoped that she could enter the White Tower for further studies. Veronica did not reprimand the girl for interrupting, but looked at the other party with gratified eyes as she introduced, not hiding her affection. "St. Eberson Academy? Buga people?" Brando's heart sunk. It was indeed a great talent to be chosen by the Silver Folk. Of course there was also enough luck. He asked, "Marquis Toon? Is it the Conqueror Toon who crossed the sea on a dragon-headed warship and conquered Chevilian?" "It's my ancestor." The girl's eyes lit up slightly. She probably did not expect that there would be someone in Erewhon who could tell the origin of her family, especially the legend of her ancestor conquering the Chevilian area. She had always yearned for it and was also the pride of her family. "You're treating Erewhon as an uncivilized area." Brando saw the look in Shido's eyes and knew what she was thinking. He glanced at the other party's attire. The cross on the white shirt was a typical blood cross emblem. The Blood Cross was a prestigious scholars' organization in Cruz. Its status was a bit similar to Erwin's Royal School of Geography, but the Blood Cross did not have such a young member. He must be an honorary apprentice in name. Then who is this? Brando looked at the corner of the tent. He had already noticed the man who had been quiet and had not spoken. The other party was wearing a coat sewn with mink, and under the coat was a military uniform, but there was no family emblem on the silver breastplate, only an eagle emblem. This kind of attire looked a bit like a mercenary, but the plaid trousers, brand new deerskin boots, and the gem on the hilt of his sword proved that the other party's identity must be extraordinary. This was a man who could keep his composure. As soon as Brando walked into the tent, he saw him and Shido standing behind Veronica together. But unlike the frivolous curiosity of the other young scholar, this older young man had not spoken, but looked at them with sharp eyes in the dark. His silence made Brando feel a soldier's reticence. But until this moment, Lenoret Aurelius. Before Veronica could speak, the young man answered in a cold tone, as if he could be proud of this surname. After he answered, he closed his mouth and resumed his previous silence. So it's you? When Brando heard the name, he thought that the other party could indeed be proud of this surname because it once belonged to a man with the name of an eagle, and the words associated with it were the Empire and the Supreme Power, His Majesty the Emperor. But at this moment, Brando could not help but think of Lorena and Philas strangely, for no other reason than that the other party was the victim who was rashly killed in Philas' dream, the eldest grandson of Emperor Grantity the Great. And also the future His Majesty the Emperor. Brando also did not expect that the future legend would appear in front of him, and so young at that, he could not help but take another look at the other party. As if noticing his look, Veronica's face showed a smile of amusement. Now I don't need to introduce you, little guy. Brando smiled bitterly. Of course there was no need for that. The nobles of Cruz had an ancient practice of sending their children out to gain experience, but this tradition was no longer followed by most families, because too many outstanding descendants died in the experience because of assassinations and accidents. But the royal family of Cruz was really bold. Dragons are high and mighty in the eyes of us mortals, but they also have many eccentricities. For example, they have an almost paranoid greed for wealth. As far as I know, this time we are facing a timid young dragon. It chose to act sneakily not because of the dragon's nature, but because of its personality, Brando continued. A timid dragon, huh? Interesting. Teacher was right, you can only see this complicated world clearly when you go out of the door, Shido praised with some surprise. Don't underestimate it because it's timid. No matter what, dragons are terrible opponents. Even if it's just a young dragon, even the most cowardly person would dare to easily crush an ant to death. Brendel warned. You're right, Shido nodded politely at him. This little guy. Brando was a little speechless. Veronica, however, heard the hidden meaning in his words, narrowed her eyes and asked, Brando, you mean you can find it? I don't have the ability to track a dragon, that's the job of the elven dragon hunters in Essatok, but I happen to know where it's hiding. Brando smiled slightly. You know where it's hiding? Veronica's green eyes lit up, she turned her head and couldn't help but praise. You really didn't let me down, little guy, it seems like nothing can stop you. You flatter me, I was just lucky. Don't forget, I'm on good terms with Duke Anthony, and Duke Vero isn't against forming an alliance with me. They're the real masters of this place. This young dragon has been living in this area for quite some time, and the locals can't be ignorant of it, Brendel replied humbly. However, Veronica seemed to be really troubled by this matter. She still looked at Brando with appreciation. Brando, you make me regret. I mean, at your age, sigh, if only you were willing to join the Cruz Empire, how great would that be? Aren't I standing with the army commander now? The army commander's hospitality was a little overwhelming for Brando, but he couldn't choose to become a Cruz noble anyway. He chuckled and cleverly changed the topic. Veronica snorted softly, expressing her dissatisfaction with Brando's perfunctory answer. She picked up the map on the table, shook the dust off it and asked, Where is the dragon? It seems that we have to catch it before it uses all our food to fill its stomach. Army commander, are you going to move now? But compared to Veronica's haste, Brando seemed calmer. Veronica looked back at him in confusion. Of course, we can't delay it any longer. I don't know how long this matter can be kept a secret. I've already ordered the food ration to be reduced, but this is only a temporary measure. Sooner or later someone will figure it out. She suddenly stopped and asked, Brando, do you have any other ideas? Brando nodded. Actually, I brought you a message. Message? Good or bad? If it's good news, tell me. If it's bad news, then forget it. There's enough bad news, let's put it aside first. Veronica froze for a moment, then replied with the willfulness of an army commander. She walked behind the table and took her long sword from the shelf. Brando looked at the woman a little helplessly. Before we came here, we found traces of a wreck. Veronica's hand froze. She put down the sword with a click, turned back, her emerald eyes flashing with a glimmer, and looked at Brando strangely. Are you here to bring me good news today, little guy? It seems that the Holy Cathedral of Fire is really worried about this batch of portal fragments. Brando looked at her, but replied to himself. You got. They know, of course we are anxious. Do you know how much face the Empire has lost this time? You have a part to play in this, don't be too proud, someone will settle the score with you. Veronica saw Brando smile and knew what he was thinking. Brando glanced at the other two. Lenoret was silent and unmoved by his and Veronica's words, sitting there like a sculpture, while Shido held a book in both hands and looked at him curiously. In Cruz, Brando was now a household name. Since the last Holy War, had the people of Cruz ever been defeated? Tell me what the hell is going on? Veronica asked. Brando then told the story of the huntress, and when she heard what had happened to Peya, Veronica's face did not show much sympathy, but said coldly, Arek is digging his own grave. In the end, she turned back and asked carefully, you said that the girl followed the trail all the way here, which means that her brother is still alive, and left marks all the way telling you that Arek had passed through this area. She looked puzzled, but what is the connection between these two things? Are you trying to say that Arek is also moving towards the young dragon's lair? Exactly, Lady Veronica. Before coming here, in order to avoid leaking the news, there is one thing I actually did not tell you. Brando replied, you already know that Arek's trip is for the Heart of the Dragon, but you don't know that the Heart of the Dragon is in the Glacier of Despair, guarded by the young dragon. Veronica was stunned for a long time. So you have some kind of conspiracy, right? She stared at Brando and asked, what do you mean by conspiracy? But Brando still nodded. Whether it's an adult dragon or a young dragon, it's not so easy to deal with, and Arek may not dare to say that he has it in the bag, so I suspect that they will go to one place first. Where? The Holy Cathedral of the Hibernator. When Veronica heard the name, it was as if she had been pricked by a needle. She narrowed her emerald eyes, revealing a dangerous light. I've heard of this place. You're not going to tell me that those things are still alive, are you? Of course they were still alive. The alpha wolf Ekis was only temporarily sealed and fell into a demigod slumber, not to mention her children. Back then the dusk wolves chased the father of the giants, Milos the frost weaver, to this place. After a great battle, the frost giant god fell here, and Ekis blood also flowed on the snowy plains, and foul creatures were born from it. Those dark children were later sealed, but still slept in the Holy Cathedral of the Hibernator. Arek certainly had no way to deal with a young dragon. His only chance was to release those children of Ekis. Brando almost immediately guessed the Duke's idea. But the Duke certainly did not know what he was about to release. It was not the mixed bloodlines of the calamity of wolves, but the real pure-blooded demonic wolves born from Ekis blood, the real creatures of chaos. Opening the Holy Cathedral of the Hibernator would also open the path to the team dungeon at the center of the stained frost forest labyrinth. But fortunately, Brando knew that it was a seal based on time, and unless it was opened from the inside, Arek was bound to be disappointed. But he had an idea, and this idea would not only make Arek return empty-handed, but also make him suffer a great loss. This idea, to say that it was a conspiracy, did not seem to be a completely unreliable thing. Seeing the look on his face, Veronica knew that the young man had a well-thought-out plan. However, now was not the time to discuss action plans. She chose to believe in the young man, but she also said, it seems that you have thought about what to do, but I still have a question. What exactly is the heart of the dragon you speak of? I once thought it was the heart of a dragon. Well, Brando was somewhat innocent. I don't know. What? Veronica immediately revealed a murderous look. Lady Veronica, you also know. Brando glanced at the big book in Shido's hand. Much of the knowledge of wizards comes from books, and before you really see it, you rarely know what it is. You don't think that my experience is so rich that I have seen everything, do you? A sly answer. Veronica glared at him. Don't think that I don't know what you are hiding from me. You go rest first, wait for me to gather the others. Brando broke out in a cold sweat under the stare of the Legion commander. He did not expect Veronica to see through his lies. It was just that he did not lie about the origin of the heart of the dragon, but he did not tell the Legion commander that the reason he knew all this was not from books, but from a game with the same name as this world. This was something that could not be explained in the first place, was it not? Brando did not intend to be entangled in this issue. He simply bowed to the female Legion commander, turned around and prepared to leave with the others. But at this time Shido followed closely behind. Before Brando lifted the felt of the tent, she shouted, "Mr. Brando." Brando turned around. "What? I was just a little curious. Mr. Brando, you are the most knowledgeable Erewhon person I have ever met. Do you really know the habits of the dragon race?" Shido asked curiously in a low voice. But Brando always felt that there was a hint of suspicion in her pure and innocent eyes. "No, I don't know." He simply shook his head. There were some things that could never be explained to such a prejudiced little girl, especially when the other party was a stubborn scholar, a female scholar. "I've only heard rumors. I also heard that dragons especially like human girls, and would snatch beautiful girls back to their lairs. Did you know that?" Shido's eyes widened. Her blue eyes were like sapphires. She looked at Brando with sparkling eyes. "Mr. Brando, you really know how to joke. I have never heard of this. How smart." Brando thought. The girl hesitated for a moment before asking, "Mr. Brando, I heard that you are a descendant of the Highland Knight? I heard that the people of Cartier still maintain their tradition of marrying stepmothers and daughters-in-law as wives. I heard that after your death, your souls are not purified in flames, but collected and stored in jars and buried on both sides of the road. Is this all true?" Brando looked at this girl strangely. He was stunned for a moment before answering with a straight face, "Yes. Not only that, we also maintain the habit of drinking raw meat and drinking blood. If there is a disagreement, we will draw our swords and kill. Where we come from, women can have many men and men can have many women. How is it, are you scared?" Shido was stunned. Her face was full of disbelief. The girl just stared at Brando with her mouth open. "Sorry," Brando looked at her and added, "what I said before was a lie. P.S. That's all for today. 6K words. I have to go out in a while. I will come back later to look at the book review section and answer any questions from yesterday. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation." Chapter 757. The ice and snow were like the tip of a knife, flashing and freezing to the bone. The trees on both sides of the glacier were shaped like ice crystals, standing coldly. The cold wind passed through the woodland, bringing with it the sound of subtle breathing. Freya clasped her hands together and stared at the vast expanse of white glaciers below. There were sparse black dots scattered on the glaciers, and a team of about a few hundred people was moving forward with great difficulty. The scene in her field of vision was faintly discernible, occasionally obscured by the wind and snow. The future goddess of war frowned, her eyebrows covered in snow. She was wearing a thick cloak, which almost completely covered the fur-inlaid armor underneath. She looked like a hunter hiding in the forest. Her field of vision extended outwards. Hundreds of soldiers in the same silver cloak were hiding in the bushes, motionless. From a distance they were almost the same color as the snow. Maynard looked at the time. The pocket watch was almost creaking due to the low temperature, but the needle was not wrong. She handed the pocket watch to Freya. "Is it them?" "It's them." Freya nodded in confirmation. Seeing that those people were almost the same as what Brando had said to her, and there should not be a third force here. We're lucky that their half-baked lord guessed it right. Not far behind Freya, a few Kurlutz nobles were squatting together and discussing in whispers. Under the white cloak was a pale blonde youth who seemed to have overindulged in sex. He was only 21 or 22 years old, but the emblem on his collar proved that he was an official knight. He said so with a mixed expression of disapproval and amusement, which caused a burst of low laughter. Another person laughed and said, "But Lady Veronica actually listened to that guy's slanderous words and gave the little girl full command. It's unbelievable." The others shrugged as well. "Just watch. She doesn't know how to command at all. How can we launch a charge at this distance? This is a glacier terrain, not hills or plains." The blonde youth shook his head. "Broad, I heard that they graduated from the Erewhon Royal Knight Academy." "I see." Browder raised his eyebrows. This distance was consistent with the distance specified in the drill, but Erewhon soldiers must lack experience in fighting on the snowy plains. Tactics should be adapted to local conditions. In his opinion, this woman was a rigid dogmatist. "Let's wait and see." He glanced in that direction. They were all excellent soldiers, so they wouldn't disobey orders. However, he was certain that the other party would fail, so he couldn't help but look in that direction disapprovingly. "Get everyone ready, the enemy might discover us first. They're just some private soldiers of Owain's nobles, they're just chickens and dogs." That Bumpkin Lord's judgment is somewhat reasonable. It's very likely that the ones below are just cannon fodder. We shouldn't encounter any trouble. He probably wants to train his commander so that we're out of luck. Behind Browder, a tall female knight with overly thin cheeks judged. He also wants us to pretend to be a dragon, a woo, one of them teased, putting his hands to his cheeks and imitating a dragon's roar. Ha ha ha. It caused a burst of low laughter all around. The low laughter finally caught Freya's attention. She took a light breath and looked back with some dissatisfaction, but she turned back with a frown. Don't worry about them. Maynard glanced at her and reminded her. I know. Freya nodded. This was the first battle that she had commanded in the truest sense, and she would never take it lightly. She raised her head, and her light brown eyes once again reflected the traces of the noble's private soldiers through the wind and snow. She couldn't help but think of the question that Brando had asked her. Please don't laugh anymore, Army Commander. Shido blushed in the wind and snow, looking very embarrassed. I'm sorry, Shido, but you really shouldn't regard the Erewhon people as barbarians. Ah. Veronica narrowed her eyes, but she couldn't help but smile. She saw the senior girl turn around a little embarrassedly and explained, their late King Eric was also a noble of the Cruz people. In fact, the Erewhon people and the Cruz people have always been of the same root, but they also have their own culture. You followed those guys in the imperial capital. The things you learned were really biased. So only when you walk out of the door can you see the real world. Shido held the book, standing in the pure snow, and glanced in the direction of Brando. Will the Count be angry? No, he's not that petty. Let's go and have a look. He's probably the only one who would recognize that thing in front. Answered Veronica, clasping the furs round her neck, and clasping the hilt of her sword in one hand, she approached with a creak. Even you don't recognize it, Army Commander? Shido was a little surprised. Don't be curious, that little guy is a strange person. He said he learned these things from the files of the Black Tower wizards. I talked to William, it seems that there are some things that even he doesn't understand. This little guy must have some secrets on him. Veronica replied. The scholar was slightly startled and couldn't help but look in that direction curiously. Brando creaked over a thick glacier. He looked up and saw something in the distance that seemed to be standing on the edge of the sky. That thing naturally attracted people's attention, like the corner of a huge structure as black as ink, obliquely inserted into the glacier. Only a very small part of it was exposed. The whole corner exuded a metallic luster, and the surface of the metal was covered with light blue textures, sparkling, in a regular geometric pattern hanging from the top of the corner, densely covering the whole body of this thing. From a distance it looked more like a temple sunk into the ground, but as he got closer Brando felt a very familiar feeling, a bit like the creation of the Hazel people, full of a structure and an industrial style. He looked up and could almost imagine the scene of that thing flying over here. It fell from midair and crashed into the ground. The energy that erupted instantly tore the earth apart, leaving deep marks on the ground. Then, it continued to slide into the distance until it lost all of its kinetic energy. Only then did it slowly stop. What followed was 1,000 years of ice, until today when they discovered it again. He slowly walked through the ravine-like valleys, which were formed thousands of years ago in this collision. The father of the frost giants, Milos, was buried here, and the ice and snow of thousands of years could prove it. He was a little lost, Mr. Brando? Until a voice sounded behind him. He turned around and saw Shido with a serious face. Do you know what this is? She looked up and looked at this great creation with some amazement. You mean that thing? Brando was a little distracted. He glanced at the black square column in the distant sky that seemed to go straight into the clouds, but his mind was not on it. This was not something important, and such scenery could be seen in many places in this glacier. It was like a background to the players, and there was no meaning in its existence. But it was indeed majestic. Brando looked up at the black column and said, That's the body of Milos. What? Shido was stunned and stopped. That's the body of a god? Inevitably, the scholar showed a look of suspicion. She was well aware of her beauty, and some people often pretended to be knowledgeable in order to get close to her. She knew when she was in the academy that many of the legends she heard were actually fabricated. She now felt that this count was the same, because she felt that he could not look like a scholar, and even if he was, he might not dare to say such a thing. She looked at the huge ruins, and her heart could not accept such an explanation. You think I'm lying? Brando looked back and glanced at her, a little amused. At least this scholar had always been interesting to him. No. Shido hurriedly shook her head. But as a scholar, I must be responsible for my words. Have you really confirmed your words, my lord? This is still suspicion, Brando thought to himself. He replied, this is actually not my words. The witch's dark prophecy recorded that in this battle, Milos disintegrated in mid-air, and the wreckage was scattered across the earth. Most of it fell into this glacier, but there was still one that fell into the Sea of the Dead Moon. The Bugis built a city on it called Onais. You should have heard of it, right? The ruins on the Sea of the Dead Moon are. Shido stared at the black building in the sky. Almost, and in fact, both the Bugis and the Black Tower mages have confirmed this. These things we see now are the remains of Milos. In the future, you may have the opportunity to enter the White Tower to study the files of the Silver Mages, and you will come into contact with this precious knowledge, Miss Shido. When Brando said so himself, he also glanced at the Black Tower in the sky. Thank you, Shido replied softly. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have doubted your words. No need to apologize. There is a saying among scholars, doubt is the door to the truth. You should have heard of it, right? Mr. Brando, are you really a scholar? Shido asked in surprise, holding the book. I've just read the literature in this area. In fact, I'm not really a scholar. That's a pity. But Brando was a little absent-minded at this moment, thinking about the action on the other side. He heard creaking footsteps coming from behind, and by the sound, he knew it was Veronica. How about it, are you confident, little one? She had obviously heard the conversation between Brando and Shido, but at the moment, like Brando, her attention could not be focused on these legends and myths. Brando did not look back but just nodded. Don't worry. Why are you so sure that Erek will really act according to this plan? Veronica frowned, but it was not that she did not believe in Brando. If she did not believe in Brando, she would not have agreed to Brando's plan. It's very simple. Brando replied. He looked back. P.S. I was discussing the plot with my book friends in the group tonight, so I'm going to update this chapter first. I'll make up for it tomorrow. It's miserable. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 758. Frost WRM Shida is the gatekeeper of the Holy Cathedral of the Hibernator. I think Erek is also aware of this. Any stranger approaching the Holy Cathedral of the Hibernator will cause a reaction from the gatekeeper, Brando replied. You're saying that Erek will definitely take advantage of this. I've heard people say that this old fox is cautious and deep. He's used to planning before acting, just like the previous duke. Veronica raised her head, her emerald green eyes flashing with a cold light. Although her hands covered her long hair, her blue hair still fluttered in the sun with the biting north wind. Her gaze passed through the ice field as if she had already seen the outcome that Brando expected, but she still asked, although I agree with this point, how do you plan to confirm it? Brando saw the snowflakes rolled up by the wind, floating on the glacier like a layer of powder. At this time, in his field of vision, a few shadowy figures suddenly appeared behind the snow and wind. He replied, We'll know soon. The figures that emerged from behind the ice fog were Babasha and her party. The old witch's body was stooped, and the ice wind was tugging at the corner of her shabby robe. Her silver hair was like a ghost baring its fangs and brandishing its claws. She limped to Brando's side and said with deep awe, Dear Lord, it's ready. She held the crystal ball with trembling hands and raised it to Brando. Veronica frowned when she saw this scene. She didn't like witches. Brando glanced at the few people behind Babasha. In addition to the girl wearing wooden shoes and standing there with her toes together holding a honey jar, there were two important figures, the inherited witch of the Moon of Swords, Slaughter, Krull, and the inherited witch of the Moon of Cups, Envy, Anwei. These two were important figures. Their status in the witch kingdom of Bunasan was far more respected than Babasha. Krull was a tall woman with a graceful body wrapped in a gray witch robe. She wore a hood. Her skin was as white as snow, her eyebrows were as thin as needles, her cheeks were prominent, and her expression was cold, giving people a feeling of indifference. Anwei, on the other hand, was like a woman in her 40s. She wore a thick fur robe, and her figure wrapped in the robe could be seen even through a thick layer of wool. The little woman's face was full of smiles, but it could not hide the shrewdness in her eyes. They said that they had come to seek refuge with Brando, but the latter realized that the attitude of the two was far less respectful than Babasha. This kind of seeking refuge was not so much a submission as an inspection. The inheritance of the Dark Dragon was divided into 7 parts, and he was not the only one. However, Brando didn't care. He was confident that he could make these unlikable fellows work for him. Brendel took the crystal ball, and a circular image immediately appeared on it. He saw that behind the snowstorm, there was a vast expanse of snow that stretched as far as the eye could see. He let his vision continue to move to the north, and the image immediately showed crisscrossing glacial gullies that looked like they were cut by swords. A crystal-like forest grew in the middle, and then there was a flat tundra. The wind blew across the ice and the snow formed ribbons that rolled forward. Shido and Veronica, as well as a few Kurlutzian nobles who followed from behind, watched this scene attentively. Detection spells were the witch's specialty, and even the astrologers who were proficient in prophecy spells could not compare to them. This power came from the blind girl Elaine, and everything in the past and future of the mortal world was reflected on the surface of the Abyss Lake. It was also said that the powerful witches could indeed detect a part of the cause and effect of the future. The spell of the crystal ball was controlled by Anwei. When Brando carefully observed the scene on the crystal ball, he also noticed the young woman. The other party was frowning slightly, but did not show any signs of exhaustion. The vision on the crystal ball was already a few miles away, which could only mean that the other party's strength was already at the peak of the gold level. Suddenly the picture flashed, and a group of people and horses trekking on the snowfield appeared in the icy wind. This group of people and horses were all wearing thick bearskin coats, holding a variety of weapons in their hands, and some of them were leading a dwarf horse. Brando looked at their attire and recognized that these were the Inhal people of the Erek Plateau. The Lantan Islands called them big-footed dwarves, but they were actually not dwarves but halflings or pygmies. It was said that Erek had a group of loyal Inhal dwarves in his hands, and it seemed that this should be the group in front of them. Halfling cavalry, they are Erek's people, Veronica also recognized at a glance. Brando, it seems that you guessed right again. This is not luck. Brando replied in a bad mood, but he is willing to use his own elites as cannon fodder. This guy Erek is really not an ordinary person. At this time, a series of footsteps came from the snow behind the three of them. Shido glanced back and found that it was their military officer group. Lady Veronica, I wonder if Brund and the others have arrived? Before the military officer group approached, the leading noble asked first. This guy was called Gerd, a core member of the Silver Leaf Arbitration Group from Cruz's Council of Elders. His identity to the outside world was that of an envoy, but in fact, his existence was to check and balance Veronica's power. This man was not a soldier, but he had the back of a tiger and the waist of a bear. He looked more like a ruffian than the knight around him. He wore a gray deerskin coat and a hat on one side, with 3 white feathers on the edge of the hat to indicate his status as a marquis. However, he did not look like an elegant noble but more like a butcher. The one in charge here is not me, Gerd. If you have any questions you can ask the count next to me. Veronica narrowed her eyes at this guy and replied coldly. Her tone was very stiff, but this commander was actually not at odds with this repulsive guy in front of her. It was a tradition for soldiers not to associate with the nobles of the Senate. However, she did not expect Gerd to push his luck and replied arrogantly, I'm sorry, Lady Veronica, but I don't trust these Erewhon people. Veronica's face immediately turned cold. Brando also snorted coldly, You really don't know what's good for you. What did you say? I said you are a complete idiot. Brando did not have a good impression of the people of Cruz. Veronica was probably an exception, but he had never been a nice guy to others. He directly reprimanded, When Freya arrives at the scheduled attack location when to launch the attack, it is only related to me here. From now on, I am the supreme commander here, not Lady Veronica and not you. If you have any questions, I don't have to answer them to you. If you are not satisfied, you can take off your pair of squirrel gloves and throw them on me. I don't mind nailing a piece of trash like you to the ice here with my sword. When the blade pierces through your loose skin, I bet your blood will be frozen under your blood vessels before it can flow out. Brando released a trace of elemental energy and locked onto the group of officers, causing Gerd's face to turn pale. You. He gritted his teeth, but in the end, he did not dare to say the second half of the sentence. I hope you're right. Gerd suddenly remembered that this guy in front of him had killed Williams. He knew that he was not as respected as the deputy commander of the Holy Cathedral of Fire's Holy Knight Regiment. If Brando was really angry, killing him would be as easy as crushing an ant. Especially when he thought that the Holy Cathedral had lost a genius swordsman in Erewhon, but there was no mention of revenge. Brando's background was so deep that it made his hair stand on end. Veronica coldly watched the argument between the two, and when she saw Gerd flinch, she could not help but frown in disappointment. Although she did not want Brando to be defeated, the courage and accomplishment of the nobles of the Empire were really unsightly. Brando, are you sure? Veronica looked away from Gerd with some disgust and asked, Although the Folded Sword Knight Regiment is the elite of the Azure Skies Regiment, your little girl only has a little more than 100 people under her command. Look at these halfling cavalry, their number is at least a column. Cruz's establishment, 500 people, it's really difficult to destroy them all. In response to such a question, Brando only smiled. Don't worry, leave it to me. He turned back. Previously he had asked the Shire to find Alaz, and it had been a long time, so it should be about time. As expected, the crowd was in a commotion. Cruz's people seemed to be separated by an invisible force, automatically making a path, and the Shire appeared in everyone's sight with Alaz. The little female dragon looked impatient, looking at the people around her with her golden eyes, like a beast. Brando, you're looking for me? Alaz walked through the crowd. I heard that you've been in a bad mood recently, so I found some opponents for you to vent your anger on. What do you think? Brando replied with a smile. If you want me to help, just say it. If it's you, I can consider it. The little female dragon slowly walked through the crowd, and where she passed, the warhorses around her suddenly let out a whine, and these tall herbivores knelt down one after another. The ones on the periphery even collapsed to the ground, and a few even twitched on the ground, and in the blink of an eye, they foamed at the mouth and died. What did you do to our horses? The nobles of Cruz immediately objected. Excellent warhorses in Erwin, in Cruz, and even in Saint Tassol and Fanzan, were luxuries worth showing off among the nobles. A noble breed of horse was more expensive than gold in the aristocratic circle, and it was also priceless, because no one would easily sell their beloved things. But it was these horses that were killed by Alaz's glare. Alaz looked at those guys coldly and replied, Your horses are in my way and I hate these smelly things, keep them away from me. You. The nobles were so angry that they almost fainted. Everyone turned their eyes to Brando, and Gerd, as if he had something on him, asked excitedly, Count, you'd better explain. You want me to explain? Brando only found it funny. Enough, Veronica interrupted. She frowned, feeling that the situation was getting out of hand. She faintly felt that there was something wrong with the little girl brought by the Ash Sword Saint. Alaz did not overwhelm the warhorses with witchcraft, but with her aura. She was the only one who noticed it. Lord Veronica, please don't be too partial to outsiders. Except for me, everyone here is your subordinate. What a warhorse means to a soldier, I'm sure you know better than I do. Gerd snorted coldly and replied somewhat proudly. Veronica looked at this guy as if she was looking at an idiot. If you want to die, then go ahead. What do you mean? Gerd was slightly taken aback. In his impression, this Legion commander of Azure Skies wasn't someone who liked to joke around. He suddenly felt a little uneasy, but it was a little too late. He suddenly heard a voice say, It means an idiot like you really shouldn't live in this world. The voice had just sounded and it was already in his ears. Be careful. He heard the sound of the knight unsheathing their swords, and could not help but turn around in horror, but it was a little too late. A tail as thick as a bucket stretched out from nowhere, and slammed heavily on him. Gerd screamed and suddenly spat out blood as he was sent flying, and fell across the ice, leaving a conspicuous trail of blood. This is... Veronica and Shido looked at the sudden change in surprise. They could not help but be surprised because what appeared under the sun was an elegant creature with shining scales, a slender neck and a pair of wings covering the body. To be exact, it was a dragon. A golden dragon. Alaz was entrenched on the ice field, looking down at everyone from above. Her huge body was almost the size of a 3-story building, and her slender neck was slightly bent, supporting a head with 4 horns. Platinum scales as smooth as mirrors replaced her clothes, one next to the other, plated with a layer of light purple metallic brilliance, which was a special color that only gradually maturing dragons would have. Alaz lowered her head, the flames in her golden eyes were burning, she looked at everyone present, and everyone was shouting in their hearts, Martha above, a dragon. We have lived with a dragon for so long. And Gerd, who was struggling to get up from the ground, was even more desperate. Now he finally understood what Veronica's words meant. He felt that he was really an idiot, hopelessly stupid. He wanted to beg for mercy, but a terrible psychological shock had spread in everyone's hearts. For a moment, most of the people present felt as if they had fallen into a boundless, pitch-black world. There was no sense of touch, smell, or even time or direction in this world. The only thing that could be heard was a terrifying scream from the horizon that was approaching from afar, shaking their eardrums. Gerd had just gotten up from the ground, but his legs were weak and he fell to his knees. Only Veronica could hold on a little. She supported Shido with one hand. The scholar's face was pale. Brando and the Shire were completely unaffected, But even so, they saw the reaction of the others and understood what it was. This was the power that dragons were born with. Draconic aura. For your arrogance, I should have gouged out your eyes and eaten your heart, to warn other humble creatures to maintain the necessary respect for dragons. But your luck is pretty good. I really don't want to scratch your dirty maggot-like body, so I'll spare your life this time. You'd better not appear in front of me again, or I can't guarantee that I'll burn you to ashes with a single breath of fire. A majestic voice sounded in everyone's hearts, completely different from Allah's tender and childish voice, as if it was a queen who ruled the world, and only a little of the little female dragon's scent could be vaguely heard. The first sentence of the voice was still on the ground, but by the end of the sentence the dragon had spread her wings and jumped up, hovering in the air, her voice rumbling through the wilderness. All the warhorses knelt to the ground at the same time. Brando, you owe me another one. When the little female dragon said this sentence, her voice had already passed through the clouds. Brando looked up, only to see a shadow passing through the snowfield as if covering the sky. Allah spread her wings, and a terrifying aura spread far and wide across the entire glacier. That was the aura of a dragon. With a crack, Erek saw a crack appear on the crystal in the hands of his wizard, and in the blink of an eye, it broke into pieces and turned into ashes. In less than 2 weeks, the powerful Grand Duke had completely changed his appearance, and his original energetic image was no longer there. He hid under a fur cloak, and the only impression he left to outsiders was a pale face that was so thin that it was almost inhuman. Erek was so thin that he looked like a skeleton, his face covered with wrinkled skin, and only his eyes were still staring motionlessly at the crystal in the dried-up eye sockets. There was still a trace of life in his eyes. My lord. The wizard turned around and looked at him with a questioning look. This is the draconic aura. That stupid dragon has indeed made its move. Erek grabbed his cane and said with some fanaticism, let's go. I know that old hag Veronica is following us. Let them follow us. They're just a bunch of idiots. My lord, your body. Shut up. Erek glanced at Devard coldly. Although he was getting thinner by the day, his majesty was more and more obvious, and the aura that grabbed people's breath seemed to be coming out of his body at any time. Devard shuddered and quickly shut his mouth. I'm not those mortals. In order to get power, sacrifice is inevitable. Remember our pursuit, only chaos is the only one and everything else is a burden. Erek replied coldly, the pursuit of emotional weakness, the ignorant grab for money and power, and the vain justice. The mortals pursue these things that are not worth mentioning. How can they defeat us? Let's go. Master defeated them in Babel and it will be the same now. He coughed and then slowly stood up. In the forest, the knight in black robes also stood up. These knights looked very strange. They were far taller than the average person, and looked like the orcs of the Great Plains. But the orcs did not know how to make armor, and their intelligence was only enough for them to use simple weapons. What was more eye-catching was that each knight had an Ouroboros symbol on their cloaks. Freya? Freya? The girl from Bucci was a little distracted. She recalled the scene at that time. Brando stood in the tent and asked her a question seriously. Freya, how will you view war? The last time Brando was so serious was when Braggs told her how to save Bucci. How should she view war? Freya asked herself. She should have hated the war. The war had taken away everything she should have. Her peaceful life, her family, her homeland. Everything she was once familiar with was lost in the raging flames. Looking back at those memories, it seemed that only deep pain was left. But Erwin can only be saved through war, and in this war, you will become the executioner you once hated. Freya, your enemy is not only Madara. You should understand this. You will kill and more people will be sacrificed in the flames of war or lose their homes, lose their families. If you are just a soldier, you can ignore it. But I know what your dream is, Freya. Do you know what your goal is? Freya grasped her sword tightly. In a trance, she saw blood flowing, and there were only endless corpses on the battlefield. Among these corpses, there was Bessa's pure and innocent face. She looked at her with empty eyes as if she was questioning her. Then she saw the little girl who died in the hands of the demon. Then she saw her family in Bucci. Freya felt that she still lacked an answer in her heart. She closed her eyes and then opened them again. Sound and her 5 senses seemed to have returned to her body, and only then did she realize that Maynard had called her several times. Freya. What's the matter? The future goddess of war turned around. Why are you in a daze? Maynard was a little dissatisfied. I don't know. Freya shook her head blankly. I think I saw a blue shadow and then I don't know what happened. A blue shadow? Maynard reached out and touched her forehead. Are you too tired recently? No? I don't think so. What time is it? She looked up and asked. See for yourself. Maynard handed her the pocket watch. Freya glanced at it, and then looked at the line of Inhal halflings in the distance. Is there any news from Brando? He has confirmed with Medisha that he is the one we are looking for. Then, Miss Alaz is already on her way. I understand. Freya threw the pocket watch into the snow. Brando asked her how she planned to fight to complete this plan. She knew very well that in order to make that old fox fall into the trap, she had to leave no one alive. She pulled out part of the Lionheart sword and pressed the cold blade with her fingertips, feeling it chill in her heart. She was no longer the little girl. She understood what it meant to be a knight and what it meant to be a soldier. Although she did not have a clear answer in her heart, at least she understood that killing could not bring peace, but at least it could solve conflicts. So her answer was simple, only one sentence. I understand, Brando. When she looked at Brendel, there was no hesitation in her eyes, because her last trace of hesitation had already been buried together with Bess and Ampere Seal. She pulled out the entire Lionheart sword and the blade flashed coldly. Everyone saw the temporary commander move and reacted. One by one they stood up. The knight took off their cloaks and threw them to the ground. Then, the noble officers of Cruz's army looked at Freya, waiting for a good show. Freya glanced at the sword in her hand, pointed it down and ordered, Go down the mountain from both sides of the hill, do not enter the enemy's field of vision. Listen to my orders, cut off the retreat of Inhal halflings on the snowfield. Before seeing the signal, no one is allowed to fight. Cruz's army was stunned. The air was like falling snow, silent and sinking. Wait, this is not in line with our orders. Brund immediately questioned, Commander, are you planning to wait? If those halfling cavalry enter the holy cathedral of the Hibernator, it will really attract that damn thief. Commander, please allow me to doubt your motives. I can understand your doubts. Freya glanced at Maynard beside her. She calmed her breathing in her heart and replied, But we are not the main attackers. Not us. Then who could it be? Freya looked up at the sky. Her gaze crossed the crystal-like treetops of the pine forest. The quiet Cruz officers noticed her behavior and also raised their heads. The clouds in the sky seemed to have a slight movement. The forest, which was full of all kinds of sounds before, quieted down for a moment, as if an invisible hand was strangling their throats. Then the clouds suddenly gathered together and separated, and a huge shadow roared out from the clouds. Brund stared at the scene with his mouth wide open, and seemed to feel that his throat was making a hissing sound. The Cruz knights stood in the forest as if they had grown roots under their feet, like a group of stone statues. Their souls were experiencing a tsunami. This was not an illusion. The draconic aura descended from mid-air, and a terrible scream sounded from everyone's souls. Only Freya had seen such a scene before. On the battlefield of Ampere Seal, dark clouds covered the sun that day, and a ray of gold descended from above the clouds, bringing the final victory of the war. She turned her head. Medisha. Sister Freya, I'm here. The silver fairy princess lifted her cloak and asked loudly, Do you want to summon? Freya turned her head. The halflings on the ice field had already discovered the dragon in the sky. Men and horses panicked together and fell into a ball. Those who were a little smarter had already begun to flee. Freya turned her head again and nodded to Medisha. Knight of Fran, listen to my horn. Medisha intertwined silver threads in her hand, weaving a silver horn. She immediately blew the horn and chanted loudly, The sky-blue flag of the plains of Malald flutters like the sea. The spears of the Fran people gleam coldly. Knight, listen to the long sound of my horn. The ancient spirits are summoning the courage in your hearts. Knight, mount with me and get ready. The voice of the silver elf was melodious like a song from ancient times. The Cruz knights heard the spell and looked at each other. They did not know what Medisha was summoning, but Brund was the first to react. Oh my God, this is the Silver King's Knight Legion. As soon as he finished speaking, Medisha had already puffed up her cheeks and blew the horn for the second time. The horn sounded melodiously, and Alaz also swept over the forest at this moment. The wind pressure swept over the canopy and swooped over the distant ice field. But when the knight looked back, they were extremely surprised to see a glowing white light and heavily armored warhorses in the forest. These warhorses that seemed to come from the heavens converged into a silver tide and came to their side in the blink of an eye. A unicorn came to Medisha's side and affectionately rubbed the little princess' cheeks. Medisha touched its long horn and mounted the horse. Freya was the second to mount her horse. Her warhorse was taller than the others, and its hooves were burning with silver flames. This was the legendary mount of the Silver King, the Holy Spirit. Everyone get on your horses. Freya ordered. Remember your task. She looked back at the planes and sighed slightly. They have messaging crystals on them. Don't give them any chance. Don't leave any prisoners. Kill everyone. When this order was given, Maynard looked back at the girl from the countryside of Bucci. Freya frowned, but her eyes were still firm. Kuwu used to be Erek's most trusted confidant. The halfling with his small head and large ears knew very well how he earned Erek's trust. It was not because of his outstanding abilities, but because of his loyalty. His father, an equally proud halfling, also served the previous Duke Erek. Their family had such a tradition of loyalty, and this was what Kuwu was most proud of. But this time he knew that he could get through the previous difficulties, but this time it might be his last time on the battlefield. He tightened his bearskin robe, still thinking about the task given to him by the Duke, to challenge a dragon. Warriors were supposed to die on the battlefield, and this was a rare honor for Kuwu. The Anhor people were the most tenacious people in the highlands, and they were the most valiant warriors. Today they challenged a dragon, and their courage would be engraved on the stone pedestals of their hometown. But the cold wind was so cold that it almost lifted their robes. The cold cut their bodies like knives, and these halflings who were used to the dry and cold climate of the highlands could not bear it. Kuwu had a bad premonition since this morning. The elders of his family often said that if the day did not start well, then everything would not go well. He broke his own water bottle in the morning, which was an extremely unsettling bad omen. The team moved forward with difficulty on the ice field, and for the whole morning, they had not traveled more than a few miles. Kuwu frowned. He was the most experienced warrior in his family, and he had been listening to the sound transmitted by the wind. Suddenly he heard a strange sound. It was like thunder passing through the clouds, but it was not so obvious, but it was still rumbling. This low-frequency rumbling soon became clear. Kuwu turned his head and stared at the sky with some fanaticism. He finally recognized that this was the sound of something flying in the sky, and it must be a huge monster. If they really attracted the dragon, then they would die here and their blood would be honorable. In just a moment, the huge shadow that they were looking forward to appeared on the horizon. It split the clouds, tore the sky, and jumped into Kuwu's field of vision in an instant. At that moment, all the Anhor halflings discovered the enemy and screamed. Among them, the timid ones were already scared out of their wits and began to flee in panic. But Kuwu could forgive them. After all, when he first heard about this task he was also stunned like them. He remembered how he was at that time and felt a little embarrassed. How could he be considered a qualified warrior? He took out Gao Yuan's strong liquor from his bosom, tilted his head back and poured it down his throat. There was a burning sensation, and then he wiped his mouth and revealed a fanatical smile. It was enough. He never expected his men to deal with a dragon. That was an impossible task. But at least they had completed their mission and that was enough. That stupid dragon had been attracted to the ice field, so Sir Lord's plan could be realized. Kuwu almost laughed out loud, but before he could laugh out loud, a trace of haze flashed across his mind. He saw the dragon's shining golden scales. It was a gold dragon. This is impossible. Kuwu's eyes widened and his face became pale. His big ears almost stood up. It was another dragon. There were 2 dragons in this ice field. No, he could not help but look around in panic. He still had a glimmer of hope in his heart. He hoped that Duke Erek's information was wrong. Perhaps it was a gold dragon that lived here and not a frost dragon. Although this idea was very disrespectful, the halfling leader did not care so much at this moment. On the horse, an even stranger sound shattered all his delusions. It was a sound that was even more distant than a dragon's scream. It sounded as if it came from the horizon, and it lasted for a long time. In Kuwu's life he had only heard such a sound once. That was when he went to the holy war with Erek, and the Fanzan Legion's horn sounded. It's an ambush. Kuwu immediately understood what had happened. They had been set up. He trembled and took out the communication crystal, but it did not respond. No, it's a law barrier. He was almost moaning. The enemy was obviously well prepared. He immediately grabbed his weapon and screamed, "Quick, run out of this area. Spread out and spread the message." He looked up, and his green pupils reflected the gold dragon's figure that was getting bigger and bigger. The shadow seemed to represent despair. A golden flame fell from the sky. P.S. 9K chapters. I won't divide them into chapters. I've been busy these 2 days and I only have time to update at night. I think I'll be free tomorrow, and I'll continue to answer questions in the book review section. I'll also solve the previous problem. Also, I'm begging for monthly votes. I haven't begged for monthly votes in a long time. begging for votes. Everyone, please support me with votes and give me some motivation. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 759. At the moment of the dragon's roar, the mountains shook. The Myrna said that the shadow of the dragon swept across the plains, and the wind brought by the wings would blow for a day and a night. Alaz spread her wings and was still a few miles away, but the wind was already raging through the forest. The triangular flags on the tips of the halflings' spears on the ice field whistled in the wind, but the darkness that gripped their hearts was endless fear. Dragon! Someone screamed, and the neat team scattered in all directions on the snowfield. Kuwu saw that he could no longer control the team, and had to escape to the northwest with his night bodyguard. In the blink of an eye, Alaz had already flown over these tiny creatures. She lowered her head, and her huge shadow shrouded the team of hundreds of people. Her golden eyes reflected the scattered halflings. Based on her interest, she first chose the small team in the south. About 20 or 30 halflings rode ponies and were fleeing to the crystal forest on the hillside, but Alaz would not give them the chance. She lowered her head and spat out a mouthful of golden flames. A large fireball fell from the sky and landed on the glacier, instantly engulfing the halflings who were still running away and turning them into ashes. The flames continued to burn on the ice, and even the ice was sizzling as it melted layer by layer, revealing the black igneous rocks below. These rocks that had melted thousands of years ago were once again turned into lava in the flames, and white steam rose up to tens of meters in the air. The scorching flames seemed to have plucked at the little female dragon's excited heartstrings. She let out a scream, flapped her wings and pulled up high. The flames from her mouth were like a golden sword plowing through the glacier, burning all the way into the forest, turning the ice forest into a blazing pillar of fire. But it was not over yet. Her golden eyes locked onto another team, but this time she did not intend to continue spitting fire. Even a dragon could not spit fire endlessly. That was just the delusion of mortals and fairy tales about dragons. Alaz rose high like an arrowhead, and then swooped down on the team of halflings. She swept over their heads, and the strong wind she brought was like a sharp blade, blowing the halflings to pieces. Some of the knights were even pulled off their horses by the huge wind pressure, hitting the hard ice and rolling for tens of meters before stopping. Their brains were already splattered. Alaz looked at these unlucky fellows and felt even more pleased with herself, as if she had vented all her anger. She let out a crisp giggle in the air, but it sounded like a deafening muffled thunder to the ears of others. The little female dragon circled in midair and landed heavily on the glacier. She stretched out her sharp claws and grabbed the ice to stabilize her body. The huge impact caused her to tear ice shards out of the ice, leaving behind more than 10 deep claw marks that were tens of meters long. Alaz turned around and swept the halfling cavalry at the forefront away with a sweep of her tail. She turned around and stood in front of these little things, and stretched out her claws to slap away a rider who could not stop in time. Her sharp claws were like 4 of the sharpest steel swords made by the dwarves. With a light slash, the knight's stomach was split open. Then she lowered her head and swallowed the little thing and the horse in one bite. Dragons were not the embodiment of justice in any legends. The Inhal halflings who belonged to Erek seemed to have finally realized that there was no hope of escaping, so they angrily picked up their spears and attacked. Although they were as weak as children in front of the dragon, these halflings were not good men and women. They were first and foremost Erek's private soldiers, veterans who had been on the battlefield and killed people. Both soldiers and civilians had died in their hands. Once on the battlefield, they were all desperados who did not care about their lives. It was just that even undead followers might not have the courage to fight against a WIRM. Alaz looked at these tiny creatures and could not help but yawn. She casually broke a few spears that were thrown at her, then raised her claws and slapped the halfling cavalry into meat paste one by one, as if she was playing whack-a-mole. When she slapped the 7th one, the halfling finally broke down, crying and running away. When Kuwu turned around, he happened to see such a scene. Those were his clansmen. His heart ached, but he knew that those people would not be able to escape. The dragon was just a cat playing with mice. The wind whistled in his ears, he held the reins tightly, his body crouched on the horse's back. The surrounding scenery quickly receded from both sides, but he did not intend to retreat into the forest, but had been retreating north along the snowfield. The previous 2 teams were first targeted by the terrible dragon because they were in a hurry to retreat into the forest. Dragons were very shrewd creatures, but most mortals only remembered their barbaric side. But Kuwu knew this very well, so he led his night guard to escape this disaster. He did not expect to survive this battle, But Kuwu knew very well that at least before he died, he must first find the holy cathedral of the Hibernator, or at least seal the young frost dragon. This was the last thing he could do for Grand Duke Arek. But things were not that simple. The big-eared halfling turned his head, and a silver light flashed on the horizon. The valiant girl on horseback was commanding hundreds of knights to chase along the glacier. The Valkyrie was wearing Erwin's knight armor, and two cloaks fluttered behind her like wings. Behind her, after experiencing the two incidents of the dragon and the Valkyrie, Cruz's knights finally reluctantly accepted the fact that the girl had become their temporary commander. This had nothing to do with Freya's leadership ability, but strength on the battlefield could indeed determine a lot of things. Soldiers advocated force, and it was an immutable truth that only the strong could be the boss. The knights of the Folded Sword Knight Regiment rode on their gleaming war horses, sweeping across the ice field like a rolling snow wave. Unlike the halflings' ponies, these Valkyries' hooves did not sink into the snow at all. It was as if they were flying on the surface of the snow, and their speed was incredible. Freya divided the knights into echelons, forming a diagonal line from left to right. She commanded them to rush down the mountain forest, then advanced north along the west side of the snow field, and soon caught up with the first fleeing halfling cavalry. Luoji. Everyone else, keep going, don't slow down. The girl shouted, and her voice spread far and wide through the strength of a silver rank, echoing on the battlefield. The name Freya shouted was the name of the female knight with a somewhat thin face. This name made Luoji frown. The female knight even raised her head and looked ahead, but did not answer. She felt a little awkward being commanded by Erwin's people, but as a soldier's nature of obedience, she still drew her sword and shouted, "10th echelon, prepare to attack." The knights behind her responded in unison, and the sound of swords being drawn rang out for a moment. The Kurletzian knights raised their longswords high, and the bright blade refracted a continuous undulating line of flashing light on the snowfield. Looking down from the sky above the snowy plains, a slanted black line was moving forward rapidly. It swallowed up a scattered group of fleeing soldiers and swallowed them into the left wing. The 10th echelon composed of Cruz's knights slowed down, but the other 9 echelons continued to move forward. Freya leaned on the back of her horse and looked back nervously, but she was satisfied with what was happening. The knights of the Folded Sword Knight Regiment had high tactical literacy and almost perfectly executed her tactics. Freya seemed to finally be relieved. She raised her head, and at this moment, the demeanor of the future Valkyrie seemed to finally radiate from this girl from the countryside of Buchi. Her eyes were shining and she drew her sword and pointed to the front. She firmly ordered, "The 3rd, 4th and 5th echelons, break away to the east. The 2nd, 6th and 7th echelons attack freely. The 8th and 9th echelons take care of the rear. The rest of you follow me." Under Freya's command, the battlefield immediately changed. Cruz's knight regiment suddenly scattered like a pack of wolves, rushing towards their respective targets, faintly forming an encirclement. Although the enemy they had to encircle was several times more than them, there was a giant dragon chasing after these halflings. No one had a trace of fear in their hearts. What's more, they were the proud elites of Cruz. How could they bow down to Erwin's country bumpkins? Even if Alaz was not on the field, they could still proudly launch a charge against these halfling cavalry. Freya's tactics were almost immediately effective. The halflings under Arek's command were finally in trouble. These Cruz's knight regiment were much more purposeful than Alaz, who was more playful. They carried out the wolf pack tactics like groups of winter wolves driving their prey forward and constantly killing those who fell behind. If a halfling cavalry tried to rush out of this net, the 8th and 9th echelon Cruz's knight regiment behind them would immediately kill all their hopes. The battlefield was littered with corpses. Some halflings saw that there was no hope of escaping and had to turn around and launch a desperate charge. They were all fierce mountain people, but unfortunately, their opponents were also the best of Cruz's academies. Even if their combat experience was slightly lacking, the average strength of a lower gold was enough to make up for any gap. Almost all of the Cruz's knight regiment had some success. From the 2nd echelon to the 10th echelon, they soon fell into a chaotic battle, but only Freya was still moving forward. She locked onto the team that fled far away at the front. She did not know that it was Kuwu and his knight regiment, but she was very clear that the other party must be an excellent commander. Freya had been paying attention to this team almost from the beginning. From the moment Alaz entered the battlefield until now, the commander's choice was almost always the best. The other party did not make a single mistake. Kuwu was fleeing north along the border of the glacier. The pony horse fully utilized its advantage in such a terrain. Wild ponies lived in the cold highlands and often had to pass through the ice gaps between the valleys to go farther to forage for food. Finding cracks in the glacier seemed to have become an instinct in their bones. On the other hand, Freya's valiant warhorse could float on the ice and move forward, but after all, it could not really fly. Sometimes a crack in the ice would kill everyone, so the future Valkyrie had to be cautious. The two sides chased and fled, and in the blink of an eye, a distance of 1 or 2 miles flashed by. Undulating ridges appeared on the ice field. Freya frowned and was a little anxious. If they moved forward, they would rush out of the interference zone that prohibited communication magic. However, she was anxious and uneasy. Kuo was also not having a good time. In his view, the horses of the guys behind him did not seem to need physical strength, and the mounts of his and his night regiments were already overwhelmed. The winner must be decided in a short period of time. This thought flashed through their minds almost at the same time. Freya gritted her teeth and tightened her grip on the reins, but Brund, who was beside her, could no longer hold back. Although, in all seriousness, he no longer had any prejudice against this commander, and it was difficult to talk about commanding in such a battle, but Freya had maintained the necessary decisiveness of a commander from beginning to end, and had not made any mistakes so far, which showed that she was at least calm enough and knew how to analyze, which were at least essential elements of a good commander. But like Freya, Brund also realized that if they continued to chase, their mission would probably fail. "We have to find a way to drive them to a dead end," he shouted intermittently against the wind. Freya was slightly startled and then nodded. This was actually her own idea, but the terrain of the ice field was changeable, and how to choose the right one was a problem. "Little Pero, we should go that way." Brund turned back and shouted to someone beside him. Freya knew the young man, a top student who graduated from St. Eberson. This thin young man may not be suitable to be a soldier, but it was said that this person's graduation grades were high enough to make all the people who graduated with him jealous. Freya was also an academic herself, and knew very well what this meant. But little Pero shook his head. "The terrain of the snowfield is too complicated and luck plays a big part. If you want me to tell the truth, I can only say that I can't tell. We can only bet on luck and see if Lady Martha favors us." He said so in the wind and shrugged. Everyone's heart sank, but they also knew that this was not an excuse. "Knight Maynard," Brund turned his head to the other side again. He knew that this knight was by Princess Erwin's side. Compared to Freya, Maynard was already famous as the best graduate of the first class of the Royal Knight Academy. "What do you think?" But Maynard's expression did not change. She did not even turn her head, standing straight in the wind and snow like a javelin, and just replied faintly, "Listen to the commander." Brund choked. But everyone's eyes had already fallen on Freya. The girl from the countryside of Bucci was slightly stunned, and subconsciously tightened her grip on the reins. She bit her lip, but did not say anything to refuse. She raised her head and glanced to the northeast. "P.S. That's it for today. I'll go to the book review section to answer questions later. I'm so tired. I'll just roll around and beg for monthly votes. Tomorrow your daily 10,000 strong baboons will be back." To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for recommendation and monthly votes. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 760. Knight Brund, do you see that crack in the west? Lead the 8th echelon around from the back and surround the cavalry from the side. Freya suddenly turned her head and looked at the broken glacier in the west, and said to Brund beside her. The broken glacier undulated through the entire snowfield, refracting the sun after noon and sparkling under the ice. Brund looked in that direction, somewhat puzzled. "Why, it's impossible to catch up from that direction." "Yes, Knight Brund, your task is to force them to change direction and let the halflings flee north, preferably northeast." Freya replied. "What's in the east?" Brund was stunned and subconsciously looked in that direction, but in his field of vision, the east and the north were the same endless glaciers. The edge of the glacier shone under the clear sky, like the edge of a mirror, piercing his eyes. He could not help but squint his eyes, somewhat suspicious. "Brund, it's the wind." Little Pero, riding on the horse, seemed to react. The wind is blowing from the northwest." No one present was a fool, and Brund immediately understood. He looked at the ice dust raised by the wind slowly moving in their direction on the glacier, and could not help but marvel in his heart. The wind was blowing from the northwest, which meant that there might be a mountain pass in that direction, and the north and east were most likely in the direction of the colonel. These things were not learned in the nobles' tactical classes and could only be regarded as common sense, but not everyone could acutely perceive and use this to make judgments at this time. The guy in front may have been aware of this early on. I don't think the other commander chose to flee in this direction to leave his fate to Lady Martha, little Pero further analyzed. He looked at Freya with some admiration and said intermittently in the wind, "We've blocked his retreat, the other party will not sit still. Lady Freya, you want to force them to turn back and fight us to the death, don't you?" The girl was slightly startled. She did not think that far ahead, but she had a faint intuition that the other party might turn back if she did so. But as a commander, she had at least learned how to maintain her dignity and nodded gently. "I understand." Brun nodded excitedly. No one was willing to listen to the command of a good-for-nothing, especially for them. Mediocrity was unbearable, but at the thought of ushering in a perfect victory soon, these young people from Cruz could not help but get excited. Seriously speaking, this was their first battle. On the entire glacier, Cruz's knight and Allah's formed a perfect suppression of the halflings. Arek's Enhor cavalry had almost no room for resistance and were strangled on the ice. Blood flowed from the corpses of the halfling cavalry and instantly froze into a pool of red ice. The 10th echelon led by Luoji and the other 7 echelons were in the final battle, and on the final battlefield the battle was about to come to an end. Kuwu saw a cavalry with a swallow-tailed flag separating from the pursuers behind and entering the shadow of the broken glacier. He understood the opponent's commander's plan. He was actually waiting for this opportunity. There were 34 night guards around him, all of whom were good lads among the Enhor people. They were the most elite soldiers in Grand Duke Arek's halfling cavalry, and the opponent's cavalry echelon only had a dozen people. He did not believe that 4 times the number was not enough to defeat these unknown cavalry. The halfling knight could not help but sneer when he saw that the enemy commander still dared to divide her forces. In his opinion, Freya had made the right choice, but in a sense, it was also a mistake. The enemy was too arrogant, or rather, their frantic escape at the beginning had successfully created an illusion, causing the enemy to think that they were weak and could be bullied. Kuwu was very satisfied with the situation he had created, but he was not in a hurry to order his men to turn around. These halfling night guards who were willing to fight side by side with him and did not scatter were all his most trusted subordinates. Good steel should be used on the blade. Kuwu was waiting for Brun's cavalry to be far enough away from Freya. He cunningly pretended to continue to flee, and as Freya wished, he readjusted his direction to the north. It seemed that the Cruz knight was fooled. He saw Brun's cavalry bypassing the broken glacier and finally understood that he had been waiting for a golden opportunity. In fact, he knew very well that at this moment, the halfling cavalry's ponies were almost reaching their physical limits, and could only support one more charge at most, but that was enough. Kuwu whistled, and the halfling cavalry accompanying him turned a corner on the ice field, facing Freya and her first echelon. "They're here." Seeing the scene in front of him, little Pero's voice rang out. Freya saw the halfling cavalry turn their horses around and could not help but breathe a sigh of relief. The opponent only needed to run a short distance forward to reach the limit of the interference magic, but fortunately, it seemed that Lady Martha was still on their side. She raised her long sword high, prepare for battle. The knight let out a restless cry and raised the shields in their hands. The halfling cavalry was one of Won's most unique cavalry. They were not heavy cavalry who were good at charging formations. These cavalry who rode ponies and even war dogs were best at close to mid-range combat. To be precise, they were cavalry who threw spears. The two sides launched a deadly charge on the ice field, and the distance gradually shortened to the point where they could see each other's tense faces, human and halfling. Kuwu's cavalry suddenly whistled and threw the short spears in their hands forward. A rain of short spears flew over tens of meters in a flash and poured into the thin line of Cruz's knight. However, the expected scene of people being thrown off their horses did not appear. The shields in the hands of the human knights suddenly unfurled one after another, and when the short spears collided with those light shields, they were immediately broken into 2 pieces and wood chips flew everywhere. Kuwu's heart went cold when he saw this scene. He did not make a mistake, but as the head of a noble's private army, he probably never dreamed that there was such a big gap between the inferior cavalry under his command and the most elite knight of the powerful empire on the continent. This kind of ignorance sometimes had to be compensated with one's life. After a round of spear throwing, Cruz's men were unharmed. On the flat snowfield, when the 2 cavalry charged at each other, there was no second chance. Probably seeing the end, the morale of the elite knight of Enhom plummeted, but the accumulated pride of the past made them bite the bullet and raise their weapons. Looking from above, the Cruz knight led by Freya looked like a thin silver blade, piercing the heart of the halfling cavalry. "They're dead meat." Brun saw this scene and pulled the reins to stop. The battle had just begun, but he could already see the result. The blonde knight said with some regret, "It's a pity that we can't participate in the battle in person. Don't worry, Erek isn't dead yet. If we clean up the battlefield quickly we might still have a chance." A knight behind him shouted excitedly. The Flame King once said that cavalry was an indomitable force. Hot blood and fanaticism were their symbols. Just being on the battlefield in person was enough to make these young people restless. "Ah, well said." The knights were talking, but Brun turned his head. He seemed to see a flash of light on the horizon. He rubbed his eyes and almost thought he was hallucinating. The sun on the ice often causes snow blindness, and sometimes it is not impossible for the refracted light to cause hallucinations. But Brun felt a little uneasy. He turned to the others and said, "Did you see anything?" "What? It's in that direction. Didn't you see it? It looks like a blue light." Brun asked with some doubts. "Blue light? No. Could it be that you're mistaken, Brun?" Brun shrugged. "Probably." But as soon as his voice fell, someone in the team screamed, "Oh my God, look over there." Brun was slightly startled and immediately turned his head vigilantly. But the moment he turned his head, his face changed instantly. "Martha above, what the hell is this?" The silent cave was covered in ice and snow. The ice that had not melted for thousands of years formed a blue wall. The glaciers sank down, forming lines. In the dark cave, the naturally formed holes crisscrossed. However, in this uncanny workmanship of nature, there were many man-made objects piled up. If you looked carefully you would find many boxes of goods from crews. The eagle emblem on them indicated that these boxes were once military supplies. On the other side there were many wooden barrels piled up. These barrels came from Fort Valendon, Lanton Island, and even further away. These barrels and wooden boxes were filled with all kinds of food. If anyone came here, they would think that they had mistakenly entered the underground storage room of a frost giant. But this was a bona fide dragon's lair. Although here you could not see glittering gold coins, jewelry, priceless artwork, gold and silver utensils, or even the dazzling gemstones that dragons loved the most, there was only food. Pickled beef, sausages, frozen fish, yogurt, bread, fruit and jars of honey and candy piled up together. But this cave that looked like a witch's candy house was indeed the hiding place of Sheeta the frost dragon whelp. To be continued. If you like this work you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for recommendation and monthly votes. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 761. Now at this moment, a meatball was running around among the food. If you looked closely, you would find that it was moving the goods one by one to a deeper part of the cave. The meatball had a pair of wings. Although the wings reminded people of the roast turkey at the New Year's festival, it had a pair of fat claws. The claws were short and small, but they could still grab the boxes and drag them back. Its thick and sturdy hind legs were obviously overdeveloped. It swayed as it walked as if it couldn't move if it didn't do so. Every time the meatball took a step back, its tail, which was as thick as a water bucket, swayed and made a puffing sound. If it were not for the dense and beautiful pale scales on its body and the two pairs of horns that proved its identity, most people would think that it was a hippopotamus instead of a dragon. Even though Sheeta was a real dragon, a frost dragon whelp that was very rare even among the dragon race, he was driven back by the dragon race when he was young. Because as a dragon, he did not store his wealth but was passionate about collecting food. Sheeta's parents thought that it was a shame, and then kicked him out on the first day he could be independent. In fact, it was this experience that created Sheeta's timid character. However, he was satisfied with his character and his current life. The humans always gave him a lot of delicious food, and this place was very comfortable to live in. Of course there was one thing. Sheeta was still a dragon after all. He felt that the humans thought that he did not notice them, which was an insult to his intelligence. In fact, whether it was for Veronica or Erek, Sheeta had already noticed these humans from the moment they entered the glacier. If a person's intelligence was directly proportional to the capacity of their brain, then Sheeta's intelligence was probably hidden in his fat body. Sheeta rested his chin on his claws and thought for a while. He seemed to remember that he still had work to do. He had been preparing to move since 2 weeks ago. The humans seemed to be up to no good, and Sheeta had never bothered to fight with these lowly creatures. Although the dragons probably thought that he was a timid dragon and the shame of the dragon race, Sheeta did not think so. Why fight? There was no benefit in fighting. Fighting would consume calories, and it was not easy for him to collect so many delicious things and raise himself to be white and fat. It was not worthwhile to find trouble with those poor country bumpkin adventurers. There was an old saying in Nine Phoenix, and Sheeta had always regarded it as his motto. Those who have nothing to lose are not afraid of those who wear shoes. And now he just felt that he was the one who was wearing shoes. How could he be confused with those beggars? All in all, our Frost WRM whelps spent about 2 weeks to move all the items that could have been moved in 2 days. In the meantime, they even used magic to make up for the time they wasted when they suddenly fell asleep. Sheeta's magic was also unique. He called it the magic of wisdom. Its specific principles were: don't use troublesome spells, don't use spells that were too long, don't use spells that required movements, and don't use spells that were too tiring. The rest were Lord Sheeta's exclusive spells. After the cave was emptied, it became spacious except for one place. In the center of the cave, there was a column of frost standing between the blue ground and the cave ceiling. This column did not look like an ice prism that was frozen by water. From afar it looked more like a trapezoidal ice wall, and on the front of the wall there was a sun inlaid. To be precise, it was an object that constantly emitted light and heat to the outside world. 4 silver rings surrounded this ball of light and slowly rotated in 4 directions. And further away from the ball of light, there were some small, mercury-like spheres that were also rotating in the same orbit. If one counted carefully, there were a total of 36 groups of mercury-like spheres of different sizes surrounding the ball of light. This was eternal energy. The witches gave it a name, Dragon's Heart. According to legend, it was a divine object that Dragon King Bahamut brought out from ancient ruins. There were a total of 12 such dragon's hearts in Wonde, but 3 of them were destroyed in the flames of war. The remaining 6 were still in the hands of the dragons, and the remaining 3 were missing. The one in front of them was obviously one of the 3 missing dragon's hearts. Sheeta looked at this thing and hesitated for a moment. Then he wriggled his meatball-like body up the column, grabbed the silver rings and removed this thing from the icicle. Then he looked at the empty groove left on the icicle. After thinking for a moment, he took out a gray gem the size of a wash basin and inlaid it in. It had to be said that the size was just right. Only then did the meat dragon nod in satisfaction. Holding the dragon's heart, he quickly hid in the depths of the cave. "My lord, this is the place." The Magus looked at the narrow crack between 2 glaciers not far away. He turned around and respectfully bowed to Grand Duke Erek, replying respectfully. Erek's body was bent over at this moment. It seemed that even the deerskin coat was too heavy for him to straighten up. He looked like an old man with 1 foot in the grave. But when he stood in front of everyone, his aura alone was enough to make them not even dare to breathe loudly. He looked at the crack. The crack was slanted under a layer of ice that was hundreds of meters thick. Inside the crack was a sea of blue. As he continued to look forward, his vision was covered by shadows. Before Erek opened his mouth, his followers had already lit torches. Although the world of Wonde had widely used magic for illumination, in most unknown areas, magic was actually an unstable existence. It could be noticed by some unknown existence, and it could also cause some trouble that you didn't want to see, especially in the Black Forest. The fire quickly lit up the cave. The narrow and long crack seemed to extend into the depths of hell. Erek naturally wouldn't take the risk himself. He first sent a team of knights in. The situation inside seemed to be better than expected. The knights sent in quickly turned back and reported that everything was safe. The dragon really left. "My lord is wise." The accompanying wizard immediately replied flatteringly. "Dragons are very arrogant. Generally they wouldn't set any traps in their lairs. Since that's the case, why don't we immediately go in and find the dragon's heart, my lord?" "What about the 2 hunters?" Devard suddenly asked. Erek turned around and glanced at him. He was a little impatient. Ever since the Battle of Ampere Seal, this guy lost to the young man. He seemed to have suffered a great setback. Even his ability to do things had greatly decreased. This made Erek very dissatisfied. Devard shivered and immediately understood Erek's meaning. He turned around with a gloomy face and gestured to the knight behind him. "Kill them." When the hunter girl hiding in the ice field saw this scene, she almost immediately wanted to rush up, but her hands sank into the snow and she forced herself to hold back. Brando turned back and looked at the girl's cold red knuckles. He couldn't help but ask comfortingly, "Is your brother in there?" Peya froze and slowly shook her head. "Even if he is in there, we can't save him. Do you see those knight?" Brando pointed to the black knight guarding the periphery of the cave. He couldn't help but squint his eyes. Those should be the Order of the Dead Knight Regiment of All for One. Erek's position in this organization is not low. "Brando, do you know something?" Veronica lay on the other side, frowning as she stared at the Black Knight. However, unlike Brando, she couldn't help but feel a little scared. She found that each of the Black Knight had a faint fluctuation of elemental power, which meant that these knights were at least at the peak of gold and elemental awakening level. But the key was that she knew that this was actually a conservative estimate, because she found that many of the knights had already shown signs of elemental awakening. She narrowed her eyes. It was difficult to hide the lines of law of those who had just entered the elemental awakening stage. There were hundreds of Black Knights. Veronica realized that she had never heard of the origins of these Black Knights before. In fact, she suddenly realized that even All for One itself seemed to have no clear understanding of the world. The four holy cathedrals all thought that All for One was a cult, but it was hard to say how much the world, including the ordinary nobles, knew about the inside of this organization. Brando heard Veronica's question and smiled slightly. "It's normal that you don't know, Lady Veronica. We often hear about the cultists and the world hates them, but when it comes to understanding, it's unknown how many people really know about them. After all, the ban of the Holy Cathedral of Fire is there, and who dares to go deep into understanding these cultists without permission? Even the nobles of Cruz, I'm afraid it's similar. From what you've said, you seem to know them very well, little guy." Veronica turned back and asked with some interest. "Naturally, the wizards know more. The four most famous branches of the cultists are Silver Heavenly Snake, Sheephead Cult, All for One, and Tree Herders. Among them, the Sheephead Cult is the devil's henchman, exuding the stench of sulfur from head to toe. They help the devil do evil, but it's actually not worth mentioning. Silver Heavenly Snake believes in their agnosticism, believing that the exploration of knowledge and order by mortals violates the mysterious majesty of the world itself. They mainly target wizards and have nothing to do with the average person. The main enemies of the four holy cathedrals are, in fact, All for One and Tree Herders." At this point, Brando paused for a moment before continuing, "But there's actually a big difference between the two. Tree Herders. The Tree Herders are said to have once belonged to the Sky Ring of the Druids. After the fall of Babel Fortress, one of the Withered Ones broke away from the original Druids. This tribe later followed the Dark Dragon and became the terrifying Tree Herders Legion, which is how they got their name." Tree Herders, Tree Herders," Veronica muttered to herself. Brando nodded, "But the Dark Dragon was defeated by the four sages, and the Tree Herders also fled in all directions, their whereabouts unknown. When they appeared again, they were already as crazy as they are now. But unlike All for One, who is enthusiastic about subverting the order of civilization, the Tree Herders have always been obsessed with stealing the bloodline of God." "Stealing the bloodline of God?" Miss Scholar finally couldn't help but ask when she heard this. Brando looked back at Scarlet. This mountain girl was once a victim of the Tree Herders, and he himself suffered greatly. But even he didn't know the root of the Tree Herders' madness. This was also an unsolved mystery that players had been searching for. He shook his head and said, "No one knows the answer to this question, and it's not what we want to talk about now. What we want to know is the current enemy, All for One." He interrupted Shido and continued, "The Tree Herders is just a loose organization. Although there are 12 patriarchs, they are actually independent. The disciples of the Black Flames who rely on them are a typical example. As everyone knows, the disciples of the Black Flames split from the former Sheephead cult, but All for One is completely different. This is an unprecedentedly strict organization. As far as I know, they lurk in any civilized country and won't, plotting every conspiracy to overthrow the regime, create chaos and war. It's not an exaggeration to say that half or even more of the wars and conspiracies in Won't have the shadow of All for One behind them. But it's such a huge organization that's inextricably linked to the nobles, but it's like an invisible monster. Everyone knows about it, but no one knows what it is." Brando frowned. In his previous life he had worked hard to find the organization behind All for One, but it was in vain. He finally came to Grecius, the country of the Knight Regiment, and found that All for One's network and claws were all over the world, as if there was no end to it. "All countries?" Shido seemed to be shocked by this sentence. But Brando hesitated and replied, "There may be an exception." "Where?" Veronica looked back at him. She hoped it was Cruz, but she also knew that it was unlikely. The Holy Cathedral of Fire was seriously infiltrated by All for One, not to mention the Empire itself. This was a helpless fact, not to mention that most of the nobles also thought that All for One was a relatively moderate cult. All for One preached all things as one, and this doctrine in fact confused many people. Only Brando knew that this one was actually not the truth itself, but the dusk. "Eloranta," Brando replied, "the only country where sages still exist." Shido couldn't help but cry out. Eloranta was the only country that was completely neutral and did not participate in the affairs of the mainland. The Holy Cathedral of Nature was also distant from the other three holy cathedrals, and rarely took the initiative in the Holy War. This country was a mystery to most people and won't. I should have thought of it, she murmured. You've said so much, but you still haven't talked about the origins of these night, Brando? Veronica asked. I was just about to say that rice has to be eaten one bite at a time, right? Brando smiled slightly. He looked at the Black Knight. P.S. Woo-woo, it seems that your daily 10,000-strong baboons won't be back for the time being. I wrote 7K words today. == no slapping in the face. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 763. The structure of All for One is composed of a Senate, a Privy Council, and a Secondary Council. The members of the Secondary Council are called councillors. Many of these councillors are inextricably linked to the nobles of various countries, and some are even nobles themselves, such as Erek, Duke Cipher, and Marquis Yoakum. There are countless lower-ranking members of All for One, but most of the councillors are not actually closely linked to All for One. They gain more benefits from All for One and pay less in return. This is actually a means of All for One to win over people's hearts. They have some evil black magic, unknown channels of information, the placement of aids, and the circulation of some unseen stolen goods. For example, they are behind the banned slave trade in Cruz, Saint-Tassel, and Erewhon. Although these illegal activities have long been banned by law, regrettably they are quite popular among the nobles, and thus have become a breeding ground for evil. The cultists use such means to lure you and our filthy nobles into depravity, and use this as a link to slowly corrupt them. A few nobles will become core members, and I think Erek is one of them. Shido was a little sad when she heard this. This was not the aristocratic circle she had imagined. It was hard for her to imagine that there might be a cultist lurking among her friends. She could not help but frown and ask, Mr. Brando, is what you said true? How could... Shido, you are inexperienced, so you don't know how sinister this world is. Most of what Brando said is true. The nobles of the Empire sigh. Veronica sighed. Brando silently waited for the two of them to finish. He knew that Veronica had reason to sigh, because she was also a member of the aristocracy. Naturally, she felt sorry for the overall decay and depravity of this class. However, he was not. Everyone thought that he was the son of the Holy Sword Darius and had inherited the glory of the Highland Knight, but only Brando himself knew that there was a more noble and arrogant soul residing in his heart. Then he continued, the Privy Council is composed of the President of the Privy Council and 113 members of the Privy Council. These people will wear the silver ring of the ringed serpent and address each other respectfully as Your Excellency. They fight for a common goal, which is to return the world to the rule of the Twilight Dragon. There are generally two requirements to become a member of the Privy Council. First, you must have a fanatical and wise belief in the doctrine of All for One. Second, your own strength must have reached above the elemental activation level. Amon, who we killed last time, should be a member of the Privy Council. I found this in his dimensional hole. Brando took out a shiny silver ring, on which two serpents were circling, biting each other's tails. Veronica snorted softly, somewhat disdainful. The All for One Society had 113 elemental activation members, but the Holy Cathedral of Fire had more than that. Even the Flame Family Knight far exceeded that number. The core strength of All for One Society was nothing more than that in her eyes. Brando felt her emotions, but he did not immediately remind her. Instead, he continued, as for the Council of Elders and the Chairman of the Privy Council, no one has seen the identities of these people. Even the number of elders in total is not clear. Their existence is only mentioned in some fragmentary information. But I think that the identities of these people should be no less than the 12 patriarchs of the tree herders, and their strength should be similar. Veronica nodded, indicating that she agreed with this guess. But she raised her head, and two sharp gazes shot out from her emerald green eyes. These two gazes fell on Brando's face. This information was also obtained from the Black Tower wizards. No, this is the investigation of the Shire when he was alive. Brando smiled slightly and replied confidently. Veronica glanced at him. She had already known Brando's identity from the news sent back by the Holy Cathedral, and naturally knew the identity of the Shire. She knew that the Shire had investigated All for One Society for a long time before he disappeared. Even the nobles who knew about it thought that the genius Highland wizard had died at the hands of All for One Society. These were all mistakes of the past, and the Holy Cathedral of Fire also played a dishonorable role in it. The female commander may have doubts in her heart, but she did not want to be entangled in this topic. Generally speaking, the Council of Elders rarely intervenes in the affairs of all for one society in the secular world. Of course, we don't know much about the actual power they have. However, the secular forces of all for one society are indeed in the hands of the chairman of the Privy Council. Two of them are the most famous. One is the Order of Chaos, and the other is the black-armored knight we see now. They have another name, the Order of the Dead Knight. These two forces can only be mobilized by an order in council signed by the chairman of the Privy Council. This shows that Arek's identity is likely to be promoted to a member of the Privy Council soon. If it's a coincidence enough, he may be filling the vacancy caused by the death of Amon. Oh, Veronica laughed softly, so it's still our responsibility. That's right, so today our duty is to continue to keep this vacancy empty. Brando said playfully, the nobles of Erewhon often complain that the expenses of the noble parliament are too high. I think all for one society must have the same problem. Let's find a way to help them solve it. These words made everyone laugh except for the nobles of Cruz, because Brando's words were a double-edged sword, ruthlessly mocking them. You're so humorous, Mr. Brando. Miss Scholar naturally heard the hidden meaning in Brando's words and couldn't help but praise him softly. However, behind Miss Scholar, Scarlet seemed to be at a loss. She looked at Shido with slight jealousy and uneasiness, then touched the ring on her finger in fear. I'm serious, but I have to remind everyone that the qualifications of a member of the Council of All for One Society are fanatical and wise beliefs. As for true fanatics, that's what they don't lack the least, Brando replied. What do you mean? Veronica suddenly heard the hidden meaning in his words. As far as I know, the Order of the Dead Knight's order is no less than 30,000 people. Most of them have the strength that we're talking about now. And among the secular forces of All for One, the Order of the Dead Knight's order's status is far below that of the Order of Chaos, Brando said slowly. Everyone sucked in a breath of cold air, suddenly understanding why Brando asked them to stay calm. In the face of such a huge enemy, it was indeed better to be cautious. But Arek must die, not just because of the portal fragment in his hands, not just because of his identity as a member of All for One, but because I think there are people here who have more reason to seek revenge. Brando glanced at Peya, the hunter maiden's hands clenched into fists, her body tensed up and trembling slightly. After a long time, she opened her eyes and looked at Brando with her dark and somewhat wild eyes, and replied while panting, "Thank you, Lord Knight." Everyone understood what Brando meant. In fact, when they saw the dragon fly into the sky, they knew that Arek must be waiting for the frost dragon whelp of Frostfang to fly out of its nest, but he didn't know that he had made a fatal mistake. In the distance, the bodies of the two hunters fell silently on the snowy plains, the blood that flowed out and then froze into ice. Further away, Arek and his subordinates from All for One had already begun to enter the long and narrow crack. The nobles' private soldiers were the first to enter, followed by the Black Knights of Order of the Dead. They were divided into 3 groups and entered one after the other. Arek and his personal guards were the last to enter. Brando rubbed his hands and looked at the scene coldly. He didn't dare to get too close. Although he didn't have a big problem, he couldn't guarantee that the others wouldn't be noticed. The Silver Knight beside Arek, Sylvia, was a genuine elemental rank master, not to mention that there were a few wizards around him. Brando also didn't trust the crew's nobles that Veronica brought with her. In fact, the team had been maintaining magic silence. Other than him who could contact Medisha with his higher authority as a planeswalker, the others' communication channels were completely closed. No one could guarantee that the people around them weren't members of All for One. Did you see the people around Arek clearly, little guy? There are a few wizards that I've never seen before, and I don't have any impression of them. They must be members of All for One. Devard is also among them. I thought he was dead. No wonder we couldn't find his body after the Battle of Ampere Seal. Brando nodded. Are we going to wait here for them to come out? Shido asked. No, the ice caves below Frostfang extend in all directions, and there are many passages inside. We have to find a way to follow them and give the Grand Duke a surprise. Brando replied. Now, wait a moment. But Mr. Brando, didn't you say that there was a frost dragon whelp inside? Shido turned around and looked at him curiously. I also said that it's very timid. Shido was indeed very timid, whether he himself, whether the dragon himself would admit it or not. One of the reasons he lived in those blue ice caves like spider webs was to avoid danger. This was a very comfortable point. Just like now, he could place his claws on the ice crevice that was covered in blue and white cracks and hide in the shadows. His green eyeballs were motionless as he spied on those uninvited guests. However, in recent days, it began to find it more and more difficult to move between these cracks. Arek's team was actually not far from Sheeta, but no one realized that there was a dragon lurking around them. Sheeta's huge white body with light blue streaks walked behind the translucent ice walls, and the crisscrossing ice prisms seemed to be his natural cover. He ordered his followers, a group of smelly ice cave dwellers covered in white hair, to attack the humans, while he himself created a landslide behind them. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Jianghu to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 764. The subterranean dwellers were not worth mentioning, but the sudden collapse was a huge problem for Arek. When no one expected it, a huge crack suddenly appeared on the ice, and with a violent tremor, a half-mile-long tunnel under the ice collapsed. Huge chunks of ice came crashing down from all directions, and the noble's private soldiers were instantly killed or injured. The wizards beside Arek immediately used spells to support a light green barrier. The ice and snow that weighed more than a few tons squeaked as it pressed against the barrier. The ghostly faces of the wizards immediately paled, making them look more like their own kind. It was a pity that Sheeta did not intend to completely collapse his nest. Otherwise they might be finished along with his little spell. Sheeta walked through the falling ice as if he was taking a leisurely stroll. Frost dragons could hide themselves in ice breath. Through the ancient ability hidden in their blood, as long as they adapted to the environment, human powerhouses would definitely not be able to discover them. He silently came to Arek's side and stretched out his claws, wanting to tear this guy into pieces. But at this time, the two black knights beside Arek suddenly turned around, and the red eyes under the steel masks lit up slightly. "What is that?" they shouted at the same time. Sheeta jumped in fright and rushed forward, spreading his wings and crashing into their chests. With a muffled bang, the two black knights' breastplates caved in like cardboard, and they flew out at the same time, crashing into the ice wall behind them. Sheeta rushed forward and picked up the two corpses that had almost been smashed into metal plates. He did not dare to stay any longer and turned around to flee. Fortunately, the ice cave was shaking violently, and large amounts of ice and snow fell from above with a loud rumble. For a moment, no one noticed that two people were missing. It took a lot of effort for the wizards around Arek to stop the collapse and dig a tunnel through the ice. The former duke finally had the time to do a head count, and found that at least 300 of his private soldiers were missing. The Knight of Order had also suffered heavy casualties. His face immediately darkened. Devard spat out the snow in his mouth and walked over unhappily. He looked around with some fear. The power of nature was unimaginable to mortals. Even if he was an elemental awakened powerhouse, if the ice on both sides really collapsed, he would only be able to turn into a piece of solid ice that would be frozen forever. This must be the work of those cavemen. The female knight beside Arek covered her face and said hatefully. Sylvia's face was scratched by the sharp ice in order to protect her lord. Her face was covered in blood and she looked terrifying. Devard nodded. No one thought that the owner of this place had not left at all. They personally felt the dragon's aura that came from dozens of miles away. No one could imitate such an aura. Fortunately, they have retreated. Devard replied with some lingering fear. Arek looked at the tunnel that was temporarily opened. The cavemen had indeed disappeared without a trace. Dragons always had their followers. For example, the black dragon and the goblins, the red dragon and the kobolds often mixed together. The silver dragon often received the service of the elves, and the gold dragon liked to live with the fairies. It was not unusual for the frost dragon to leave some caveman in its lair for him to command. He thought for a moment and felt that there was nothing out of the ordinary, so he said, "Let's move on." What the Duke did not expect was that Sheeta was also scared out of his wits. He did not expect the Black Knight to be so powerful that he almost exposed his whereabouts. With this lesson, Sheeta immediately decided to give up on attacking these humans. Instead, he found a safe place to hide and see what they were up to. Sheeta felt that he was playing a game with these humans, but safety was his first consideration. This had nothing to do with courage but wisdom. At least that was what he thought. So in the following time he secretly followed behind these humans and did not attack. He saw that they did not feel bored at all through the long tunnel under the ice. He could not help but think that these humans were really boring. But soon he saw the group of humans walking into his lair. Arek slowly walked into the hall that was naturally formed by the ice. The hall was very spacious, but the surrounding ice formed a variety of strange prisms, and the whole hall was tinged with a faint blue hue. There was also a thin layer of ice fog on the ground. He looked up and his eyes fell on the trapezoidal ice wall in the middle of the hall. In the center of the ice wall was a rare gemstone. It was a gray gemstone, shining brightly without refracting the fire. From the inside to the outside, it emitted a bright light as if there was a sun inside. Erek pursed his lips and looked at the scene. The pale light from the gemstone carved a few deep shadows on his thin face. Although he was always serious, he had to admit that he had never seen a gemstone of such an amazing size. This gift from the ancient times was as tall as a person. Such a crystal did not exist in nature at all. It could only be a man-made creation. The Duke looked back indifferently. No one had ever seen the heart of the dragon, but the wizards could feel the endless power emanating from the gemstone. It was pure magic, the essence of magic after purification. The wizards of all for one could not help but reply with a trembling voice, "My lord, that may be the heart of the dragon." Erek nodded. In fact, he felt it himself. He had been in the realm of the Peak of Gold for some time, and he could sense the power of the gemstone. He could feel the waves of resonance emitted by the gemstone, as if there was a turbulent energy restrained in it, and it would break out at any time. According to historical records, the heart of the dragon was an eternal source of energy just like what they saw in front of them. Seeing Erek nod, the wizards immediately moved. They started from the periphery of the hall and used magic to explore the floor of the hall inch by inch. Although the pride of the dragons was unlikely to set up a trap, who knew if there would be a scum among the dragons? The result was just as Erek expected. The wizards soon returned with news that there were no traps, even on the icicle and the gemstone. The gloomy look on Erek's face eased a little, but it was still scary. He turned back and ordered the Black Knight behind him, "Go and take it down. Be careful not to break it. You should know how important it is to us." The Black Knights nodded and did as they were told. Under the leadership of a knight captain, a dozen Black Knights came to the icicle together. But it was at this time that something strange happened. Under the watchful eyes of the crowd, the dozen Black Knights, including the knight captain with elemental activation, disappeared without a trace. Everyone was stunned. So much so that the hall under the ice was so quiet that even a pin drop could be heard. Those were 13 elemental activation powerhouses, as well as a true master of elemental activation. There was no reaction at all and they disappeared just like that? The wizards could not help but rub their eyes, almost thinking that they had seen wrongly. Erek turned his head coldly and looked at his subordinates. What's going on? The wizards looked at each other. No matter how they looked at it, it seemed like a trap. However, they had already checked it out and there shouldn't be any problems at all. As for the Grand Duke's question, they had no way of answering it and could only stand there dumbfounded. A disappointed look appeared on Erek's face. He pointed at the private soldiers on the other side and ordered, "You guys go over." The faces of the private soldiers immediately changed, but they had no choice in this place. They could only tremble and walk in that direction. Dilly 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 d. But it was at this moment that a miracle happened. The private soldiers of the nobles stood under the icicles perfectly fine. It was as if everything that had happened before was just an illusion. Erek was slightly startled and could not help but frown. But after a moment of hesitation, he immediately ordered the Black Knight, "You guys go over." The Black Knight's performance was much better than the private soldiers. They bowed slightly and then walked towards the icicles. But this time, when they were about 30 feet away, the same thing happened again. With a soft swoosh, all the Black Knight, including the private soldiers of the nobles, disappeared without a trace. Now everyone was stunned. The private soldiers of the nobles could be ignored as cannon fodder, but the two batches of Black Knight, together with the one lost in the previous collapse, were almost a third of the Black Knight that had been brought out in this operation. Even if the Privy Council were to investigate this loss, it was not something that anyone could bear responsibility for. Nearly 100 elemental activation powerhouses had disappeared just like that. No one could accept such a contrast. Erek's face was as cold as ice, complementing the surrounding environment. He seemed to have finally realized something. He turned around and roared, "Who is it? Get out here." The Grand Duke's voice rolled and echoed in the ice cave, but unfortunately, there was no response. This was because Sheeta was lying on the ground looking at what was happening under the ice. He could not help but roll around on the ground and let out a hissing laugh. But if someone happened to be there at this moment, they would see a white ball of flesh rolling around on the ground. No one would be able to tell that it was a dragon. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 765. Arek's voice was met with an empty echo. The expression on the Archduke's face at this moment was definitely like dark clouds gathering on the surface of the sea, as if an unprecedented terrible storm was brewing. However, few people noticed that he was frowning, and there was a hint of worry in his eyes. He was suddenly afraid that the damned dragon was still here. Seeing that his question was not answered, Arek breathed a sigh of relief. He was not Brando, and he had never heard of a dragon that could be so cowardly. Arek had actually seen a giant dragon before. That was when he was young on the battlefield of the Holy War. He had seen the mount of the Kurlutz Emperor, Grando the Great. Ever since the Flame King Gretel, the Kurlutz royal family had a tradition of signing a contract with a giant dragon, which was one of the reasons why the Kurlutz Empire was so confident. He had a deep impression of the dragon's arrogance, so he did not doubt that there was a cunning and despicable dragon waiting to ambush them. Seeing that Arek's expression had relaxed, the people around him dared to speak. One of the wizards stepped forward and said, "My lord, we suspect that the dragon took advantage of our misunderstanding. It may have placed a trap on top of the cave. Please allow us to check it out." Arek nodded but still said, "Be quick. That stupid dragon should be back soon." The wizards nodded and did as they were told. Sure enough, it didn't take long for them to find a huge magic array on top of the Hall of Ice. When the all-for-one wizards inspected the magic array, they couldn't help but find out that it was actually a teleportation array. In other words, those unlucky fellows from before had mistakenly entered this teleportation circle and were sent to some unknown corner of the world. But the problem is, when a teleportation circle is activated, doesn't it require the consent of the person being teleported? This goes against the basic principles of magic. The wizards immediately felt that it was a little inconceivable. On top of the ice layer above them, Shida was laughing so hard that he was banging his head on the ground. Fortunately, the ice layer was thick enough, otherwise the people in the hall below might have noticed the abnormality. In fact, the reason was very simple. The magic circle covered a spherical space. When the magic circle began to take effect, Shida was also one of the recipients. So it just had to keep answering, "Yes, I'm the one who got teleported." Accept. Good. Activate the magic array. Then he could watch as the unlucky Black Knight was teleported away. As for why it hadn't been teleported away, the reason was even simpler. It was common knowledge that teleportation circles had their limits. If it could only transport 4-pound objects, it would not work on 6-pound goods. Within that limit, it would only work on the goods that could be used. And with a certain dragon's meatball-like body, it was almost certainly overweight. Shida remembered where the formation led to. It scratched its head as if it couldn't remember clearly. Anyway, it was a very far and not fun place. In short, Shida would definitely not want to go there. The all-for-one wizards studied under the magic circle for a long time, but they couldn't figure it out. In the end, they could only conclude that this was a dragon spell, an ancient string magic. Naturally, it wasn't something they could understand. As for the mysterious patterns on the magic circle that were clearly made up of modern magical runes, they naturally chose to ignore them. After all, the problem now was not to study the magic circle, but to find a way to appease Duke Arek's anger. Arek seemed to have noticed that these guys were fools. These wizards were his assistants from the Privy Council, but it was a pity that even as the chairman of the Privy Council, he couldn't mobilize the Order of Chaos alone. Therefore, other than the Black Knight, he could only find some lower-ranking members to make up the numbers. As for whether these people were reliable or not, it was clear at a glance. He snorted coldly and interrupted their nonsense. "Your mission is not to figure out how this spell works but to destroy it. We don't have much time, so you better not waste your precious lives. That frost WRM may be stupid, but it's more than enough to freeze you into popsicles." "My lord," the wizards quickly replied. "Although it's a little troublesome to figure out how this magic circle works, it's very simple to destroy it. Magic circles are actually very fragile, so they're usually hidden. However, this magic circle is actually floating on the ice. As long as a few spells are used to destroy it, it won't work anymore. Yes, that dragon does seem to be a little stupid. If it buried this magic circle behind the ice, it'll be much more troublesome for us to deal with," someone said aloud. Arek nodded, but he didn't think so. He felt that no matter how stupid the dragon was, it wouldn't be as stupid as these guys in front of him. Besides, he was already a little impatient. He waved his hand and let the wizards quickly deal with the magic circle. In the quiet passage, the sound of the previous avalanche still lingered. Brando and the others walked through the cracks of the glacier. They could even feel the buzzing under the dark blue ice on both sides. The young prince walked in front of everyone, holding the lion's fang tightly with both hands. In this enclosed environment he was as alert as a rabbit. If he had ears they would have been pricked up. "Teacher, Madam Legion Commander, did you hear anything?" Haruz suddenly turned around and asked. "Sound? No, you mean the previous avalanche?" The scholar was startled and asked. "That's not an avalanche. It's the sound of the glacier collapsing somewhere here. It must be that coward's movement." The young frost dragons are born with the ability to manipulate glaciers. A cold voice interrupted her. The one who spoke was Alaz. This young lady flew back from the battlefield. It was said that she didn't think it was fun there, so she hurried back. Brando asked her about the battle situation, and sure enough, everything was as expected. Freya's performance was better than expected. The only accident was probably the sudden snowstorm, but Maynard and Freya reacted in time and asked everyone to retreat to shelter. In fact, Brando actually suspected that the little female dragon flew in from the outside because she was afraid of the cold. Gold dragons, like red dragons, liked hot environments. Naturally, they could not adapt to such glaciers, not to mention the temperature in snowstorms that often dropped below zero. However, there were few storms on this glacier, and Brando suspected that there might be a magic tide behind it. As soon as Alaz spoke, the others fell silent. Now everyone knew that the little girl in front of them was actually a terrible dragon. Even now the envoy Gerd was still lying on the stretcher. Alaz's eyes were shining. Only Haruz was a little used to the habits of the young lady of the dragon race. He explained in a low voice, I'm not talking about that. Mr. Brando, did you hear that?" Brando nodded. He heard it more clearly than anyone else. In the buzzing caused by the avalanche, there was another sound mixed in. He turned back and looked at Veronica. The female Legion commander also had a look of concentration and held her breath. "Seems to be magic," she replied after listening for a while. "It's magic." Brando nodded. "Just the sound of the bombardment of magic energy. I seem to hear the sound of dark magic flames rising from the sea of magic. Only the wizards of the cult are good at using such magic." "Black magic. Did Arex people fight with the dragon?" Veronica asked. Brando looked ahead and shook his head. "I'm afraid not. I didn't feel the fluctuation of string magic. The ancient string magic of the dragon race is one of the most terrible spells. It is the complete opposite of black magic. It is a means of directly controlling the lines of law to constrain the bombardment of energy. Once someone uses string magic, the shock caused can be transmitted several miles away. You will definitely have the chance to see that kind of spiritual throbbing." Alaz heard this and snorted softly. She could not help but say, "Hey, you're very familiar with our spells." For such a question, Brando had already dealt with it easily. He casually replied, "All the wizards are trying to study your spells. Ancient string magic and ancient runic magic together are the origin of all magic. They're just fools. Our ancient magic comes from the memories in the bloodline. Mortals can't learn it no matter what." Alaz looked disapproving. Brendel did not refute. The magic system created by the Myrna people to this day was definitely not as bad as Alaz said. This was the era of mortals, and even the dragons had to admit this. However, he skipped this question and directly answered Veronica. "I think maybe Arek is dealing with the cave dwellers under the glacier." "You'll know when you see it," Veronica replied. The group continued to move forward and passed through the original path that Arek took. They did not encounter any resistance along the way. After half an hour they found Sheeta's lair. But at this moment, it was beyond recognition. The first thing he saw when he walked into this naturally formed ice hall was potholes on the ground, broken ice walls, and corpses strewn all over the place. However, he looked around and did not see any corpses that belonged to the dragon or a wreck. It was as if the two sides had a great battle, but no one could do anything to the other. Everyone was stunned, not knowing what had happened here, but Alaz was the first to react. Her golden eyes turned, and she ran over to one of the corpses, then checked some of the small objects on the body and then frowned. Among everyone, her figure flashed and suddenly disappeared from the hall. Just as everyone was dumbfounded by her actions, an earth-shattering shriek suddenly resounded from within the cavern. "Ah, Sister Alaz, I was wrong, let go." To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 766. "Ah, Sister Alaz, I was wrong, quick, 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 let go." With a loud bang, the top of the ice hall suddenly burst open, and a huge creature fell from the sky with a large amount of snow and ice, landing heavily on the ground. Then Brando saw Alaz jump down from above. She walked slowly to the pile of snow, reached her hand into the snow, grabbed a tail, and then dragged a ball of meat out with a whoosh. Then everyone saw that it was actually a dragon. A round dragon. It was huge, almost as tall as a small two-story building, but the whole body was not like the beautiful streamlined shape that Alaz had when she transformed into a dragon. Instead, it was like a huge spindle, and the two pairs of wings were like the wings of the chicken that Brando had seen in the supermarket freezer in his previous life. The only difference was that there were some scales on it. Alaz grabbed its tail and dragged it out, its short and fat limbs flapping on the ground, screaming like a pig being slaughtered. Brando swore that he would never forget this scene in his life, because it was too stupid. In fact, he had never seen the true face of this dragon in his previous life, because this guy was too insidious. Often, players would be lying on the floor before they saw its face, just like Arek's noble private soldiers buried under the ice. As for the others, Shido and Haruz had long been staring with their eyes wide open. They could hardly believe what they saw or felt that their whole worldview had been turned upside down. Shida put his little claws on his head and cried out, "Let go of me, Sister Alaz, it's too embarrassing." His voice echoed in the cave, but it was hard for others to believe that such an imposing roar was actually begging for mercy. "You also know how to be embarrassed, Dragon God above. Look what you've done to your lair. How dare you set a trap in your lair? You've disgraced the face of the giant dragons." Alaz snorted coldly, raised her small fist and punched Shida's head. Her pink fist looked weak, but Shida flew out as if he had hit a meteorite, and with a loud bang, the broken half of the ice wall in the center of the hall was shattered into pieces. All the crew's nobles who saw this scene were now nervous, and those who had offended Alaz before felt a chill down their spines. Almost everyone was thinking, "God, this little girl is violent." But Alaz was indeed very violent. She seemed to be mad with anger, and just like an angry sister, she gave the fleshy dragon a good beating. Of course, this fat beating was from the dragon's point of view. If it had been anyone else, even Veronica would have been beaten to a pulp. The education campaign lasted for half an hour, and then Alaz dragged Shida with a bruised nose and swollen face to meet Brando. As Brando expected, Shida's human form was indeed a little fatty, but in the form of an elf. Elves who were passionate about beautiful things would probably want to stab him to death if they saw him like this. "I know you, human. My sister told me about you. She said that big sister has a crush on you dash," Shida said in a muffled voice as soon as he opened his mouth, but before he could finish, Alaz grabbed him by the wrist and threw him heavily over her shoulder onto the ice. She smashed the little fatty on the ground, then clapped her hands as if she had dropped a bag of flour, looked up and replied, "His sister is Flora, my life partner. You should have seen her before. You stole her earrings, do you remember?" Brando knew that the golden folk reproduced asexually, and the mates of dragons were in fact allies in a sense, but what was this blabbermouth talking about? What did she mean by he stole Flora's earrings? He looked back and saw Veronica and the others looking at him strangely. A man stealing a lady's earrings, what kind of behavior was that? Especially when this lady was a dragon. The men's eyes were full of admiration, but the women present had a complicated look in their eyes. "You're amazing, Mr. Brando." Shido praised from the bottom of her heart. "Earrings are very important to dragons. Legend has it that Tiamat and Bahamut were once twins, and Martha gave them 2 earrings respectively. One was called Order and the other was called Destruction. But since the era of chaos, the separated earrings have been given a symbol of love. I don't know if this saying has only been passed down in human time, but I didn't expect the Lord to have personally put it into action. For scholars, the combination of knowledge and action is a very important part." Brando just wanted to shut this senior's mouth, but Alaz had a smirk on her face. She reached out and stroked Shido's cheek and praised, "Little girl, you said it well." "This is praise?" Shido was slightly stunned and blushed a little. She knew the custom among dragons, that an elder putting his hand on a younger one's face was a sign of praise. Of course, in a sense, Alaz was indeed a lot older than her. "Correct, you're very smart." Alaz nodded, "This is the friendship I give you." All the crew's nobles present heard this sentence and their eyes turned red. Brando could not help but feel a little envious. The friendship of the dragons was the same as the friendship of the silver elves. It had a time limit, generally speaking it was a mortal's lifetime, and there was also a limit to the number of times, generally it was once. But this meant that as long as it was within the ability and preference of the dragons, they would help the mortals fulfill a wish. Shido was still in a daze, and Veronica had already gently patted her on the shoulder. She had brought Shido out for training and she liked this little girl very much. The whole empire was also unanimously optimistic about her as the next successor to the head of the Royal Library, and an important core figure of the future Blood Cross Association. Of course, the main reason was that the Bugas valued her. However, Veronica liked her purely out of love for the younger generation. Vahina was too willful, and the Prime Minister's daughter was too paranoid, especially the latter. Ever since Veronica knew what the other had done in Brando's territory, she had been frustrated, but she had to send the latter back to the Empire. No one knew better than Veronica about Brando's position in Erewhon at this moment. Among the nobles of the Empire, she was probably the only one who knew about Brando's other identity in the loop of trade winds, and his relationship with the Silver Folk. Erewhon was no longer the original Erewhon. After having Valhalla, it was destined to rise as a new empire. Sometimes Veronica even felt that she could see the faint shadow of the Flame King Gretel, or the Lionheart King Eric of the Erewhon people in Brando. Therefore she was very optimistic about Shido. Shido was pure and kind, far more suitable to be the link between Cruz and Erewhon than Vahina and the other Prime Minister's daughter. It was a pity that the others did not think as far as she did, and probably could not understand her thinking, so Veronica could only hide some of her arrangements for the time being. However, at least everything that had happened so far had proven that she had made the right choice. In her opinion, everyone around this very interesting little fellow was indeed not simple. Not only did he maintain close ties with the Silver Folk, but the dragons also favored him. And Shido benefited from it almost immediately. At least, whether she had a wish to fulfill or not, the friendship of the dragons would have a profound impact on her life. As long as this news was spread back to the Empire, the qualifications of an important member of the Blood Cross in the future might become the next president of the Blood Cross. However, Brando interrupted the conversation between the two. He knew that he could not let this discussion continue. This little female dragon was definitely deliberately making fun of him. She knew that he had just gotten the earring by accident. He suddenly remembered something and asked, "Wait, Fu Luofa is his sister, and the big sister he was talking about is?" Brando was halfway through his words when he suddenly saw the golden flames in Allah's eyes. He suddenly felt a chill in his heart. The little female dragon bared her white teeth at him, making Brando realize that it was better not to continue on this issue. However, he had a subtle feeling in his heart and could not help but look at Allah strangely. "What are you looking at?" Allah glared at him and snorted coldly, "Is there a flower on my face?" No. Brando quickly shook his head. What a joke! It was no joke to annoy this little female dragon. Shido was still lying on the ground with a bloody nose and a swollen face. He was a dragon, born with the strength of a gold rank, and in fact, after elemental activation, his pure physical strength was close to the level of a perfect body. If the little female dragon intended to make an example of him, he would probably be torn to pieces in minutes. "Humph, you don't have to be surprised. As I said, I still have a good impression of you. Even as a backup mating candidate, it's not impossible." Alaz blushed and continued. But these words were a bit too fierce. Shido was stunned, and Scarlet seemed a little helpless. Veronica looked at the young couple, with a smile. As for the other Cruz nobles, the way they looked at Brando was equivalent to looking at a dragon. Or rather, they might not be so surprised to see a dragon at this moment. Some of the bolder knights of the Folded Sword Knight Regiment even gave Brando a thumbs up. "No one will think you're a mute if you shut up." Brando could not help but reply with gritted teeth. Alaz glanced at him and snorted softly, "Who allowed you to talk to me in such a tone? But forget it, I'm too lazy to argue with you." After saying that, she turned and left, disappearing outside the hall in the blink of an eye. "Mr. Brendel?" Shido seemed to have been scared out of her wits. She finally managed to say something. You don't have to say anything, this is all a misunderstanding." Brando knew that he was played by the little female dragon again. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 767. Alaz did not leave for long, but she was called back by Brando, for no other reason than that they still had to get information from Sheeta, the fat dragon. Unfortunately, this timid dragon whelp refused to meet anyone other than Alaz. Brendel had no choice but to ask a female dragon whelp to drag him out of his storage room. But after the guy was dragged out, the first question he asked immediately shocked Brando. "What? You mean you exchanged a star-shaped stone for the heart of the dragon and let Erek take it away?" Brando stared at the little fatty with a swollen nose and a swollen face in front of him, and his heart suddenly felt as if there were 10,000 antelopes roaring across the endless grassland of Central Africa. The little fatty nodded with an innocent look, as if what he exchanged was not a star-shaped stone, but a cobblestone casually picked up from the river. Despicable, shameless, insidious and cunning. He made an attribution in his heart, but still felt that it was not enough and had to add, Too insidious, too shameless. What is a star-shaped stone? Veronica looked at Brando's strange expression as if he had eaten a crab raw. She knew that there must be something wrong with this so-called star-shaped stone, but she searched her memory and could not find any relevant information. She thought that this must be a kind of gem, and there was indeed a type of gem called the star-shaped sapphire, but that was just a general luxury, and did not seem to have any connection with the current situation. Besides, Veronica felt that even if Erek's brain had been swept by a dragon's tail, he would not have mistaken the star-shaped sapphire for the heart of the dragon. Have you heard of the elemental frontier? Brando looked back with a strange expression and asked. I know, the elemental frontier is the border of Wond, and Lady Martha put the code of law on the Sea of Magic to form a stable world. The 4 elemental worlds guard the 4 directions of Wond, but scholars generally believe that these 4 directions are not in a spatial sense. The part of the elemental boundary that can be seen with the naked eye should be above the sky. Shido whispered. Good answer. People generally think that the elemental frontier is an abstract or theological concept, but in fact, it really exists, and there are some special creatures living there. It is said that the giant whales of the heaven realm, which are as huge as mountains, swim on the elemental border, but they can only be seen on the day of the 3 moons. Brando paused for a moment as if he was stuck. He really felt that this matter was too outrageous. It was simply unimaginable. As for this star-shaped stone, it's actually a more euphemistic name for it. Seriously speaking, I think it's better to call it the excrement of the heavenly whale. Huh. The Kurlut's noble officers present felt that they had seen or heard all the bizarre things in their lives today, and some even couldn't help but ask, My lord, you mean this dragon? Lord tricked Erek with a piece of the celestial whale's excrement? These words were really a bit witty, and the crowd couldn't help but burst into laughter. But Brando glanced at Sheeta, who was sitting calmly on the side. If that was all, of course, it could only be regarded as a funny anecdote, but he knew more. He coughed and continued to remind them, in fact, it's far more than that, the star-shaped stone. Although it's excrement, it's not wrong to say that it's priceless. It's just that most people can't use it. So, Brando, what's going on? Veronica frowned suspiciously and asked carefully. The heavenly whale feeds on energy on the elemental frontier, and its excrement is actually the residue of heterogeneous energy. It's just that the heavenly whale has a huge appetite. To what extent? It needs to eat enough magic power every day to sustain the Buga's floating city for 100 years. Because it's on the edge of the Sea of Magic, there's an endless supply of magic power for it to absorb. Brando stopped and asked, Do you know what it means to have more heterogeneous magic power? The Shire's face suddenly changed. Wait, it can't be? He muttered to himself. You guessed right, the star-shaped stone is an unstable super bomb that can explode at any time. Most of the star-shaped stones will be destroyed when they enter the law of Tiamat. I don't know where Sheeta got this thing from, but I know that Erek may be in big trouble soon, if he intends to put that thing on his precious portal. Brando replied in a daze. Veronica was also slightly startled. How powerful is it? Brando looked back at her. He wanted to ask the female Legion commander if she knew of a weapon called a thermonuclear weapon, but the latter obviously had not heard of it, so he thought for a moment and described it. It's enough to completely flatten Lushta from one end to the other. Are you kidding? Veronica blurted out. Behind her, the noble officers of Cruz sat there as if they had seen a ghost, and for a moment, they seemed to be petrified. No, what I said is true. I don't know how this thing appeared in Wond. In theory, it should have ceased to exist before it entered this world. Brando murmured. At this point, he suddenly thought of something and turned his head subconsciously. Sure enough, he saw the hunter girl Peya's face turn pale. My brother? We have to find a way to stop them. Veronica also immediately reacted. Martha, above, this thing will completely flatten the stained frost forest. Brando, the seal in the center of the stained frost forest. Brando nodded. In fact, he had thought of this for a long time. He couldn't help but glare fiercely at Sheeta. This guy doesn't understand the situation. Once this thing explodes, not only them but even this damn dragon will turn into ashes. They can't escape from this place in a short time. Those guys spied on my treasures, of course they deserve this. Sheeta pouted and replied with an unconvinced look. Of course, the so-called treasures it was referring to was the food it had stored in several caves. Marcia, above, this frost WRM was not lying at all. If anyone dared to touch its food, it would rather destroy the world and take revenge. As for flattening the stained frost forest, what was that? Aren't you the guardian here? Shido stared at the little fatty in disbelief. Sheeta looked disdainful and replied, Tisk, I only agreed because that guy promised to give me delicious food every day, but the food he gave me was not delicious at all. Don't think I don't know that he used magic to conjure it. That food is really annoying, I didn't want to do it for a long time. The funny thing is that those idiots actually thought that they could lure me out by going to the Holy Cathedral of the Hibernator. What a bunch of idiots, I might as well go back to sleep if I have the time. Before he could finish his words he was hit hard on the head. Alaz glared at him and slapped him on the back of the head, almost sweeping the little fatty under the ice. You idiot, don't you have the least bit of shame of the dragon race? You actually sold yourself for a little food and became a watchdog for others? She was so disappointed that she could not help but scold him loudly. Also, you actually gave away such a fun thing so casually. That heart of the giant dragon or whatever rubbish, isn't it better to just throw it out? Fun thing? Fun thing? Fun thing? Brando, Shido, and Veronica had the same thought in their minds at the same time. What was fun about this? This thing can take a person's life, okay? Have you two figured out what's wrong with it? Brando suddenly felt a little powerless and felt that it was a very wrong choice to give the lead of the topic to this little female dragon. He hurriedly interrupted them and said, "Wait, don't talk about this first." "I don't know." Shida's answer was so clean that it was obvious at a glance that the fatty was lying. But this time Brando did not intend to let Alaz come. He turned back and called, "Haruz, come here." The little prince looked at him blankly and came over with the lion's fang in his hand. He asked somewhat puzzledly, "Teacher, is there anything I can do for you?" "You go over and persuade him to tell us where Erek went," Brando said, pointing to Shida. "Meh." The little prince looked puzzled. "I can?" "Of course, don't worry, he will listen to you like a dog in a while. But remember, don't give it all, don't sell yourself." Brando replied faintly. "Give it all? Give what?" The little prince blushed, but he could not go against his teacher's words. He could only bite the bullet and walk over. When Shida saw Haruz, his eyes lit up slightly, but soon showed a disappointed look and said loudly, "What, he's obviously a man, I won't be interested in this kind of guy. Quick, find me a little girl, maybe I'll agree to tell you the news you want to know." Brando almost pulled out Haurangaya and slashed at him immediately, so that he could cut this nasty and lecherous fat dragon in half. He took a light breath and told himself to calm down. The other party was a dragon, even if it was a young dragon, it was not something he could deal with. But this guy was really nasty to a certain extent. What was he thinking? Brando finally calmed down and saw that Shida's eyes suddenly became motionless, or to be exact, nailed to Haruz. Then everyone saw that this guy's eyes were blurred, and a line of crystal-clear saliva flowed from the corner of his mouth in public. At that moment, it was as if a group petrification spell fell from mid-air. Except for Brando, whether it was the crew's nobles, Brando's accompanying knight, even Shido and Veronica were stunned for a moment. What was going on? As the person in question, the young prince was shocked. He shouted, What are you doing?" But Shida seemed to have heard nothing and pounced on him. At that moment, Alaz could not help but look back. Brando laughed in his heart. Sure enough, it was exactly the same as what those guys mentioned. "You're obviously a child and you're still pretending." He heard Haruz scream but thought so in his heart. P.S. The strong in your hearts will never wither, 5 times a day fighting the heavens and the earth. From today onwards I've decided to change my name to 5 times Glaze. No, 5 times Strong Baboon. Okay, I'm asking for monthly votes. I'm asking for 5 times the monthly vote support. To be continued. If you like this work, you're welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for recommendation and monthly votes. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 769. Shida licked each of his chubby fingers one by one, and then looked up at Haruz with an unsatisfied look, scaring the little prince so much that he quickly covered the honey jar at his waist. That was bought by Brando from the hunters before entering the stained frost forest, although it was used a lot on the ferries. "Do you still want it?" Brando stared at the guy and asked to draw his attention back. Shida turned his head and nodded like he was pounding garlic. Yes, yes. Alaz could not help but snort in dissatisfaction when she saw this scene. This guy was really a disgrace to the dragon race. She could not believe that a proud dragon would be bought over by half a jar of honey. Half a jar of gems was more like it. The little female dragon thought angrily. She simply turned around and left, unwilling to stay here for a minute longer. She really wanted to pretend that she did not know him. Shida was completely unaware and just looked at Brando eagerly. His expression was naturally faked. Brando knew, but he still found it funny. "Don't look at me like that, you know what we want to know." Well, those guys ran away from the other end. That tunnel leads to an exit outside. I can point it out for you. Shida pretended to think for a moment, and then his memory seemed to be restored by half a jar of honey before he answered slowly. Brando glanced at the direction he pointed, but did not change his expression. Instead he asked, "You must be very familiar with this place. After all, you have lived here since the year of the venomous spider. More than 100 years is enough for you to figure out every passage under this glacier." "How do you know?" The little fat dragon opened his mouth wide and looked at Brando dumbfounded. "Because of the documents, you fool." Alaz heard the sound coming from the entrance of the cave. She turned around and reminded him in annoyance, "Humans like to record all kinds of strange things on perishable paper, no matter how big or small they are. You don't think that if you rob them of their food they'll be okay with it, do you?" Brando nodded and replied slowly, "Before coming here, I've borrowed the history of the Manowir region from Kirkle's archives. The first time you appeared was during the year of the venomous spider. You plundered a convoy transporting flour." "Wait, why did you rob the convoy that was transporting flour?" The little female dragon widened her golden eyes in confusion and asked while gnashing her teeth, "Are you going to bake your own bread? Why haven't I heard you mention this before?" Shida lowered her head and blushed. "I thought it was white sugar." "Enough!" Alaz shouted, "Get lost, don't talk to me again, I want the patriarch to expel you from the clan." After saying that, she angrily ran out. Brando looked at her terrifying appearance and was afraid that this little female dragon would not be able to hold herself back and kill Shida. When he saw Alaz running out, he breathed a sigh of relief and turned back to ask, "So am I right?" "Almost." Shida replied weakly. "What's wrong?" Brando looked at him and could not help but be a little curious. "The dragon clan doesn't restrict you much, does it?" "It's okay." Shida suddenly became a little vigilant and glanced at Brando with his pair of small but bright blue eyes on his chubby face. Cunning human, don't think you can get any useful information out of me even if you tell me these useless things. What do you want to know?" "Not as cunning as you." Brando thought to himself, this guy's honest appearance is definitely a wonderful disguise, but in fact, only those who have dealt with him know the messy things in his head. He replied, "Since you know every passage under this glacier, you must know if there is a shortcut for us to catch up with a wreck, right?" "Why should I tell you?" Shida asked, rolling his eyes. Brando had expected this reaction and was not surprised. He only turned back to the little prince and said, "Huruz, give it to me." With that, he stretched out his hand. Huruz looked at him reluctantly. This forest was not as comfortable as the palace. The honey was his favorite candy and he would only eat a little every day. If he handed it over, there would be nothing left of the honey. The little prince was not stupid. He looked past Brando and glared at Shida with some dissatisfaction. "Give it to me." Brando winked at him and insisted. "Teacher." The little prince did not dare to disobey. He could only walk up slowly, untie the jar tied to his waist, and put it in Brando's hand with a pout. Brando patted him on the shoulder and put a candy in his hand. This lactose was a new product of Tanajal. In this world where food was scarce, candy was a luxury that only the nobles could afford. However, it was very popular among the nobles of Erewhon. The Roman lady had been eyeing this business for a long time, and Brando had helped her with a lot of ideas. After all, compared to Wond, the material life of modern society was much richer. Huruz held the ball of lactose and could not help but be surprised. He had tasted this candy in Tanajal. Although he usually only got a reward on the day he practiced swordsmanship particularly well, he would never forget the taste for the rest of his life. He carefully put the candy in his bag, and then sat back with his lion's tooth in satisfaction. Of course, Shida also saw this scene. He looked at the honey jar in Brando's hand and then looked at the little prince's actions. There was a strong light of curiosity in his eyes, but he resisted the urge to speak. Brando saw this childish action and could not help but laugh. "How about it? A piece of information for half a jar of honey. It's not a loss for you, is it?" He suddenly felt a little startled. He felt that what he said was like those strange uncles who used lollipops to kidnap lollipops. However, he did not have a lollipop, and the little fatty in front of him was not a lollipop. Shida was a dragon and a very bad one at that. Even the dragons did not like him. There is such a passage. When Shida heard Brando's condition, he could not help but reply with saliva dripping from his mouth. He was really drooling. He bared his mouth and silver silk flowed down from the corner of his mouth. After a while it dripped all over the ground. This scene really made people wonder how this guy's saliva glands were so developed. "Can you point it out for me?" Shida nodded vigorously with the jar of honey in Brando's hand. Brando smiled and handed over the jar of honey. "You keep your word." This is you dash, humph. Sheeta quickly hugged the jar and replied proudly, you're a man of your word. You're much better than that blue guy. But I heard that you humans are extremely cunning. Why are you so stupid? Brando almost couldn't breathe. He coughed twice and hurriedly said in his heart, a child's words carry no harm, a child's words carry no harm. But even so, he almost wanted to directly activate his berserk talent and beat this damn little fat dragon up again. That has nothing to do with you. Besides, this is not called stupidity. This is called honesty. I don't need to lie to a little kid like you. He replied with gritted teeth. Sheeta, can you lead the way for us? No. Sheeta flatly refused, as if this sentence didn't need to go through his brain at all. Brando looked at him as if he wanted to hear this guy's reason. Are you sure? Of course. It's too troublesome. That tunnel is very long and we have to walk a very long distance. Think about it. After walking such a long way, we still have to come back later. Even if you give me 7 or 8 jars of honey, I won't agree. Besides, Sheeta naturally added, it's so cold outside. It's so cold outside. You're a frost dragon, okay? Brando had never heard of a frost dragon being afraid of the cold in his life. Frost dragons even had the ability to control glaciers. They were born in glaciers. Legend has it that the cold was their breath. Every frozen fog on the ice field was their warm and comfortable home. And it was such a dragon that actually told him that it was too cold outside. Brando resisted the urge to go berserk with great difficulty. He calmed down and replied, it's cold outside but you're not that good inside, right? Nope, I have food here. Sheeta replied proudly. Your food can go to hell. Brando screamed in his heart, but his face was as calm as ever. How much food do you have? You rob those humans every once in a while but they're getting smarter. What can you rob? Jerky? Salted fish? Or hardened rye bread? Sheeta, these things you've collected are not food at all. In their eyes they're just garbage. You can ask them if you don't believe me. Brando pointed to the crew's nobles not far away. Sheeta looked back curiously. Those nobles had already received the signal from Veronica's eyes. Besides, even at this moment, Brando was not someone they dared to offend. Besides, what Brando said was not a lie. Jerky, salted fish, and hardened rye bread. These things were only sought after by the poor. Nobles, even the smallest of nobles, would not touch these things. So they nodded in unison. Sheeta's eyes widened, and his blue eyes were sparkling. Really? There's something more delicious than these things. Oh. As he spoke, his saliva flowed out. Brendel did not know how to describe the dragon, because its saliva was actually dripping onto his black noble's coat. He resisted the urge to send the damn dragon flying with his sword and nodded, of course, you can't just rob and rob here for the rest of your life, right? The dragons can't agree with your values because they don't understand the true meaning of delicious food. If there's a chance, I'll take you to 9 Phoenix. It said that they have the most exquisite food in the world. Sheeta's eyes sparkled as if he had been immersed in a moment in the future. But he quickly wiped his mouth and woke up. Brando saw that Sheeta's eyes had regained clarity. He had to praise the dragon for being the most intelligent high-grade creature. He had completely calmed down so quickly. Unexpectedly, Sheeta rubbed his nose and said, that's great. When are we going? Veronica couldn't help but cough when she heard this. Brando took a deep breath, opened his mouth and swallowed back the words he wanted to say. Then he said premeditatively, anytime, but do you want to consider leaving here with me? I promise to provide you with enough exquisite food. I guarantee you've never heard of it before. Wait, humph, you're scheming again, human. The little fat dragon suddenly raised his head and looked at Brando with some vigilance. But I have to eat a ton of candy every day? You're a pig. Brendel almost blurted it out, but he clenched his teeth and said, no problem. You know, I have a very large territory and I have many sugar workshops. I can guarantee that I can satisfy your requirements. Really? Sheeta looked doubtful, but his chubby face was full of yearning. Shido finally couldn't help but laugh. In her opinion, the dignified Count of Tanajul had become a sugar factory director in the eyes of this dragon. This was really too incredible. It was not until this moment that the scholar deeply understood this sentence. If you don't go out of the door, you will never know the world. At least until now, the majesty of the dragons in this world had basically collapsed in Shido's eyes. Of course it's true. Brando replied snappily, but do you understand my request? You've taken benefits from me, so you have to do things for me. You don't want me to feed you for free, do you? He had to remind her because this guy in front of him was not reliable at all. Of course, if he could ally with a dragon, even if it was a young dragon, it would have a profound impact on Erwin's situation. Brando raised his head and glanced at the nobles of Cruz not far away. Those guys were obviously stunned and didn't think of this for the time being. Only Veronica and he looked at each other. The Legion commander smiled at him. Unexpectedly, Sheeta frowned and replied impatiently, "That's why you're really stupid." "Of course I understand. Isn't it just signing a contract?" I signed a contract with that damn guy, but since that guy can't fulfill the requirements of the contract, I have now decided to unilaterally terminate the contract with him." He raised his eyelids and glanced at Brando. "How is it, have you written the contract?" Brando looked at this guy dumbfounded. He suddenly felt that this damn fatty was pretending to be a pig to eat the tiger. Why did he suddenly speak so eloquently? What Won's contract and what not? It seemed that even he didn't know much about it except for the Roman. "No. Not yet." "Oh, that's okay, we can make a verbal contract first." When it came to food and contracts, Sheeta seemed to have become shrewd and replied, "I swear in the name of the dragon god." "You can swear in the name of Martha." But Brando was completely confused. He stared at this little fatty who suddenly became serious and wondered if there was some kind of conspiracy. Or was there some kind of setting in the game? Did the players try to kidnap this guy in the past? While he was thinking about these messy things in his mind, he blurted out a sentence that he would regret for the rest of his life without thinking. "Verbal contract? Do we still need to make a pinky promise or something?" Sheeta looked at Brando as if he was looking at an idiot again. The little fatty blinked his eyes as if he thought he heard wrong. "What are you talking about? I didn't expect Big Sister to have a crush on a retarded child." "Ha." At this moment, the Shire finally couldn't help but burst out laughing. "P.S. I'm so tired from writing yesterday. I'll only update once today to recover my energy." To be continued. If you like this work, you're welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 770. Sir Commander, we have already walked for almost 2 miles. The mountain that was used as a landmark can no longer be seen behind us. With such a heavy snowstorm, I'm afraid we will get lost if we continue walking. The Knight Cruz patted the snow on his breastplate and looked at the snowy sky with some worry. The biting cold wind pushed the snowflakes between the sky and the earth. This snowstorm came so suddenly that no one had time to prepare. The knight looked at the bad weather with some concern and expressed his opinion to the female knight in front of him. Freya stopped and sighed in her heart. Her face was red from the cold and her eyebrows were covered with frost. But Freya blinked and replied, "No, let's move forward another 500 meters. They are injured and can't run far." "Freya, if they were injured we would have caught up with them long ago. No one can run too far in this weather." Maynard's voice came from behind. Everyone turned around. The female knight was as calm as ever. At the same time she reminded in a cold tone, "There's something fishy about this. Have you forgotten what Brund and the others said? But that could be an illusion on the ice field, the refraction of the sun, or the snowy shadow of the crystal forest. It could have produced a similar illusion. He said he saw wolves. Do you know what that means?" Maynard interrupted her. "This storm was brought by wolves. This is not a good sign. The Myernas fear wolves because wolves are part of the twilight, representing doom and the destruction of the world." "But, didn't the others not see it?" Freya was not sure. She looked at the white snow in the depths of the sky and felt that there was a pair of pale eyes watching them from behind the snowy shadow. The others were the same. They always felt that this glacier was malicious towards them. It was as if a stranger would suddenly appear behind them without a sound. It made their hair stand on end. The whistling of the wind was like an endless mournful wail. Maynard paused for a moment. Her voice was as cold as ice. She looked at the others coldly. "Nothing is impossible in the Black Forest. Everything is possible. If you have a premonition that something bad is about to happen, then it will definitely get worse." Of course, the Knight of Cruz had heard of this proverb and felt his scalp tingle. Freya was also hesitant. At this moment, a person suddenly stumbled out of the snow in the distance. That person was the second batch of scouts sent out not long ago. Their mission was to find the first batch of scouts sent out half an hour ago. But when Freya saw the expression on this person's face, her heart sank slightly. "Little Pero, Aaliyah, Sir Commander, Emerald and Anika. What's going on?" "Shut up, Aaliyah, let His Excellency the Commander ask the questions." Before Freya could speak, the knight behind her spoke first, but little Pero, who was next to Freya, turned his head and interrupted the man's words. The thin black-haired knight exhaled softly and forced his companion back with a cold gaze. "It's okay. What's going on?" Freya had no time to be distracted. She looked at the scout and asked, "What happened to them?" I don't know. When we found them, they were already. The scout's shoulders were almost trembling. Seeing him like this, the others' faces instantly sank. They were comrades in arms and had graduated at the same time. They swore that they would make a name for themselves in the upcoming holy war. But today they were defeated in such a small place. Everything that happened here wouldn't even be remembered by anyone. How could this be? How could there be something that could kill them? In this damned backwater? The knight couldn't help but jump up and curse angrily. You shut up, Aaliyah. Little Pero still scolded him coldly. But he turned his head and his eyes fell on Freya. Freya's heart was also a little depressed. This was the first time her subordinates had suffered casualties. For a moment she even thought of Bessa's face. However, the future Valkyrie blinked her eyes and shook her head. Who killed them? Was it those halflings? His Excellency the Commander? Emerald and Anika. The scout's face showed a look of fear. They died a little strangely. Strangely? I can't say. We can't see what killed them. There were no obvious wounds on their bodies, but it was as if their blood had been sucked dry. But there were no vampire bite marks on their bodies either. He took a deep breath and said with wide eyes, that guy Lolo said they were frozen to death. There are ghosts in the ice and snow that will extract people's essence, but I think that guy is talking nonsense. Who is Lolo? Freya turned back. He has the blood of the mountain people and the Myernas. He's a weird guy. Little Pero replied. Freya was a little surprised. She did not expect the Empire to not discriminate against the mountain people and the Myernas. But her thoughts only stayed on this matter for a moment, and then she replied, take us there and have a look. Freya, have you thought about it? But on the side, Maynard frowned at this decision. Senior, Freya looked up, Brando abhors evil and Erwin's people are not people who do not take revenge. Whether they are Cruz's people or not, they died at my hands. I don't ask for immediate revenge for them, but at least find out who killed them. I understand. Maynard replied faintly. She grabbed the reins of the Valkyrie as if she had expected Freya to answer like this. She just said, I'm just reminding you. Have you thought it through? I've thought it through. Freya replied resolutely. Her words pierced through the wind and snow, causing everyone to shudder. But the Kurlutzians finally had a trace of approval when they looked at her. Leneret Aurelius looked at the silhouette of the figure that was becoming more and more obvious in the wind and snow. His slightly tanned face that was hardly like a member of the royal family had always maintained an unchanged expression, but this did not mean that he did not pay attention to everything that was happening around him. At least the young man who was slowly approaching him on a horse fell into his eyes. Your Highness Leneret. Haruz looked at the tall young man with some envy. The other party was also the first heir to the throne, just like him but much calmer than him. For so long, other than announcing his name, the other party had hardly said a word. This steadiness made him very curious. Haruz was eager to know how to do better with his identity and how to appear so confident. Leneret Aurelius looked back at the young man and replied, Your Highness Haruz, under the rule of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, you and I are equal. You don't have to fall behind me. This is against the etiquette of the two countries. Haruz blushed. He didn't expect to make a mistake in etiquette all of a sudden. He didn't mean to, but he was used to following behind his sister or teacher. Reminded, he quickly loosened the reins and stepped forward. Your Highness Leneret, have you ever thought about the fact that you will inherit a huge empire in the future? Thousands of people, their future depends on your hands. Have you ever thought about what will happen if you do something wrong? I'm sorry, although it's very rude to say this, but I often think about it. Haruz asked in a low voice. That's not rude. Leneret replied, Of course I've thought about it. It's part of my power and responsibility in itself. As for the thousands of people, their future depends on my hands. You're right, if I do it right they will sing praises and if I do it wrong they will bear the responsibility. Haruz heard these remarks and couldn't help but widen his eyes. How can this be? Because by then I will be the supreme emperor, and in this capacity, I naturally have to maintain the majesty of the imperial power. It's the same for you. When you grow up to a certain age you'll understand this. God has given us this power and we should be careful to maintain it. Leneret Aurelius raised his head and replied proudly. But shouldn't the duty of the royal family be to fulfill the noble's contracts and bring a happier and more stable life to his people? Haruz was dumbfounded. Who told you this? Leneret turned back and asked. It's my teacher and my sister. The young prince replied in a low voice. What they said is wrong. Your sister is only a woman and that earl must have other plans. The eldest son of the emperor faintly replied. Haruz felt that there was something wrong with this statement, but for a moment he didn't know where to refute it. He couldn't help but stutter, but my teacher is a very upright and knowledgeable person. If you discuss it with him, Your Highness Leneret, you will understand this. There's no need. Leneret Aurelius replied, Haruz, you are the only one here who is qualified to talk to me as an equal. I don't have to listen to the opinions of the others. Even in your country, Your Highness, the Count is not an important minister so far. You should learn to choose your own rights. Haruz was slightly startled and nodded as if he understood. And at the same moment, Brando saw a certain silver fairy princess coming through the wind and snow. He threw a candy to Sheeta, who was not far behind him, and let the fat dragon run to the back happily. Then he raised his head and asked Medisha the first thing he said. Is Freya not back yet? I'm sorry, my lord, I didn't persuade her. Medisha frowned and shook her head worriedly. It's not your fault. Brando looked up at the changing sky and replied softly, I know Freya's personality. The weather is a little strange, but maybe we have to go against the wind. P.S. I wasn't feeling well yesterday and today. It seems that I won't be able to get full attendance this month again. I'm speechless. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 772. Several ice sculptures were either sitting or lying in the snow. Men and women had the same stiff and empty expression on their faces. Their eyes were almost frozen into ice as they stared straight at the sky. Freya felt a little sad as she walked past these ice sculptures. She silently touched their cold eyelids with her hand. Just like what the scout said before, Emerald and Anika did not have any obvious wounds on their bodies. Their skin was gray and white, losing moisture and shrinking together. Together with the corpse of the warhorse that was kneeling below them, they were covered with snow. On the surface they looked like people who had frozen to death in the snow. But how could 5 or 6 people coincidentally freeze to death together? Moreover, Anika and Emerald were both gold-ranked warriors. This kind of low temperature should not affect them at all. Freya noticed Emerald and Anika's empty eyes. In her memory, there was a way to die that had similar eyes, and that was to be taken away by the spirits. Thinking of this, she suddenly remembered the night when they escaped from Fortress Reeden. Brando used the white stag to guide them. Under the dense night sky, the majestic creatures emitting fluorescent white light opened a path in the forest. But what she remembered most were those who died in the hands of the spirits. Their faces were pale and they were sweating profusely. They also had the same empty look as if they had lost their souls. Freya raised her head. She raised her head a little vigilantly. She and the team were already in a silver-gray forest. The whistling snow wind passed through the bare branches, and those branches made a strange sound as if monsters were howling in the forest. It's ghosts. The monsters in the forest can absorb people's souls. This forest must be their territory. We have to leave here as soon as possible. Among Cruz's night, a dark-skinned young man said nervously, When I was young, I often heard the old people talk about them. No one can kill them. Once they entangle us, we are dead. Enough, Rollo. You are a gold-ranked warrior. Not many of those spirits and ghosts are your opponents. If they come, we can avenge Emerald and Anika. The knight named Aaliyah replied impatiently. He turned back to look at Freya and asked, Miss Freya, do you think there really might be ghosts in this forest? The commander he referred to had also been upgraded to Miss Freya, because Freya's decision had won the trust of every Cruz person present, and trust was the basis of cooperation. Anika is similar to you. They died without any warning. What can you do about it? Lolo was unwilling to let him off. He stared at him and asked, So we should run away with our tails between our legs? Enough, don't mention Anika to me, it will only make me angry. Lolo, don't make me look down on you. Aaliyah replied angrily. Aaliyah, shut up. Is this how you talk to your companions? Little Pero finally could not help it. He tugged at the soft gray squirrel fur hood and reprimanded, then turned back to Lolo and said, Lolo, a knight swears by folding his sword that he will never abandon his companions. I will pretend I didn't hear what you said before, but don't let me hear it a second time. The dark-skinned young man seemed to be a little afraid of him. After being warned, he did not dare to talk back. He could only stare silently. Aaliyah also snorted coldly and turned back. He grabbed his sword and looked in the direction of the forest. It seemed that although he did not believe Lolo's words, he had at least raised his guard. Little Pero turned back and looked at Freya and asked, Miss Freya, what do you think? Lolo is at least right about one thing. Anika and the others died without warning. Even if it was a sneak attack, it was too peaceful. Anika is a veteran scout, not inferior to me in the slightest. Freya frowned. The bodies of Anika, Emerald, and the others did not look like they had experienced a fight when they were alive. They looked like they were walking and suddenly fell dead here, but those were 4 gold-ranked warriors. She looked in that direction and suddenly noticed a subtle detail. Senior, did you notice their gazes? Huh? Maynard raised her eyebrows slightly. Anika and the others should have been looking ahead when they were alive. That's the forest. There may be something in the forest that attracted their attention. Freya replied. What exactly did they find in the forest? Aaliyah asked. It certainly can't be an attacker. If the attacker came from the direction of the forest, Anika and the others would not have no reaction at all. Little Pero replied. The others looked at each other and could not think of anything in the forest that could make Anika and the others relax their vigilance. After all, Anika and the others were professional scouts in the Folded Sword Knight Regiment. They were the best nightingales, soldiers among soldiers, and would never let their guard down easily. The wind and snow seemed to have stopped for a while, and everyone felt a strange silence between them. They could not help but look at the silver-gray forest, and suddenly felt a little creeped out. Did you hear something? Someone suddenly asked. The man was wearing leather armor and a dark brown robe. He was the only priest in the Cruise Knight Regiment. What's the matter? Aaliyah asked inexplicably. Listen, there's a sound in the wind. Little Pero put a finger to his lips with a serious look and gave the others a look. Everyone shut their mouths. The wind carried a low but sharp voice from No. 1 high school. It sounded like a whistle. The sound came from afar and suddenly flew up from the forest with a crash. Everyone subconsciously held the hilt of their swords and looked up, and then they saw a spectacular scene. A gray, crystal-carved bird flew up from the canopy and into the sky. The crystal-clear bodies of these birds reflected the blue light of the great demonic tide in the sky in mid-air, flashing into one. They flapped their wings and flew high in the wind and snow, making a clear chirping sound, and in the blink of an eye, they passed over everyone's heads. Everyone present was stunned. They didn't expect that this seemingly lifeless place would have so many beautiful creatures hidden in it. It's the crystal swan. Oh my God, these are elemental creatures that are rare even in the mountain of ceasing storms, so many of them. Shido will go crazy when she sees them. A knight suddenly shouted. It was indeed a spectacle, but little Pero and Maynard reacted much more directly. The two pulled out their long swords and reminded the others, shouting, Be careful, there's something in the forest. More than a dozen cruise knights suddenly froze. After the crystal swan, there was the sound of trees falling down in the forest. Obviously, the crystal swans were startled by these things behind them. Everyone stared at the forest with wide eyes, trying to see what had attacked Anika and the others. But soon they held their breaths. A huge shadow gradually appeared behind the wind and snow, and the shadow gradually moved forward and became clear. Then they saw a wolf, a huge wolf as tall as a mountain. Its silver mane fluttered fiercely in the wind and snow. Its ears were long and pointed, a little different from ordinary winter wolves. However, one of its eyes was golden and the other was golden. Inside there was a light of wisdom and coldness. It looked down at everyone from above. The forest was like a meadow under its feet, and the cruise knights present were like ants in the meadow. This is... Little Pero looked up and stared dumbfounded at the scene. Alpha Ekis. Maynard could not help but change her expression. Impossible, shouldn't it be sealed in? She suddenly realized something and subconsciously shut her mouth. What should we do? Everyone subconsciously turned their eyes to their only commander, Freya. But at this time, everyone noticed something very strange. Freya was gone. It was as if she had disappeared into thin air. Maynard's heart sank. But at this moment, no one understood that Freya was actually standing in the same place, and she was more surprised than everyone present, because what she saw was completely different from the others. At the moment when the wind blew, Freya first heard the howls of wolves in the forest. There was no crystal swan, nor was there Alpha Ekis. She only saw many pale eyes suddenly appear in the darkness, and those eyes gradually walked out of the shadows of the gray woodland, and then formed a huge snow-white wolf. Freya did not recognize these strange wolf-like creatures, but Brando might be able to call out their names here, the Pale Suns. One of the Alpha Ekis's favorite twilight species. Legend has it that they ran across the snowy plains, bringing storms wherever they passed. But their alpha, Lepizer, died at the hands of the sky dragon, Chili, and they also fell in battle with the frost giant King Milos. Freya's eyes turned cold, and she immediately pulled out her long sword. But it was at this time that she discovered something very strange. The future Valkyrie found that the night of cruise around her, Little Pero, Aaliyah, Rollo, and even Senior Maynard, were all standing on their horses with a blank look, as if they had not noticed the scene around them at all. Freya was shocked for a moment, and the death of Anika and Emerald instantly appeared in her mind, and she could not help but break out in a cold sweat. Senior Maynard? She hurriedly pushed Maynard, who was in a daze beside her, with her hand, and the latter swayed slightly, as if she had just woken up from a dream. She first saw Freya and was slightly startled, then frowned and asked with some confusion, "Freya, where have you been?" "Run, Little Pero and the others are dead, I'll help you block Ekis." "Wait, what are you talking about? Everyone's still alive and well." Freya hurriedly interrupted her, "We've been surrounded, get ready to fight, Senior Maynard." "Fight?" Maynard was stunned, and then noticed the scene around her. She was stunned on her horse and could not help but blurt out, "The Pale Sons? How could it be them? Where's Ekis?" As soon as she finished speaking, a scream suddenly came from the forest. "The goddess of war. This is impossible. Why would the bloodline of the goddess of war still exist in this era?" The voice was so sharp that it did not seem to be any intelligent creature on the continent of Wond, as if two files were crisscrossing together, making a metallic noise. Freya and Maynard were startled and subconsciously looked in that direction, and they immediately saw a silver figure over there. That thing looked a little like a human because it had 4 limbs. It stood on 2 feet on the ground, and its hands were long and slender, reaching below its knees. Its entire body was covered in silver-white skin, but the most terrifying thing was that this thing had no eyes, nose, or ears. Its smooth face only had a black hole that could be called a mouth. And beside the human-like monster stood an old acquaintance of Freya and Maynard. "Marquis Yoakum?" Freya looked at the man in disbelief and asked, "Aren't you dead?" Marquis Yoakum smiled faintly. "I will not die so easily before I dedicate my life to the true God. Freya, you and your lord should have arrived by now, right? In fact, we've been waiting for him here for a long time." Freya's heart thumped. "P.S. I wasn't feeling well 2 days ago, so I took a break. By the way, Amber is about to enter the magnificent main storyline, so I also need to organize my thoughts. I'll start updating today, but I'll have to slowly recover, so I won't make any promises. The only thing I can say is that everyone wait and see what's behind the continent of Wond. Also, the chapter, Eternity, involves a lot of content, so it might be a little long. If you like this work, you're welcome to vote for it at Chidian.com. Your support is my greatest motivation. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.